May 2, 1957, Manhattan. Frank Costello steps into the lobby of his apartment building, and a gunman fires at his head. Costello survives, and the man federal investigators later identify as the shooter still walks free. This is why the real Vincent, the Gigante story, is worse than Goodfellas. Section 1. The boxer who took a shot at Frank Costello. Vincent Louis Gigante was born in New York City on March 29, 1928, to Italian immigrant parents from Naples, and grew up around Greenwich Village. In the 1940s, he boxed professionally in dozens of bouts around New York and nearby cities. That record showed a young man who trained, traveled, followed rules, and functioned in a demanding profession years before severe psychiatric incapacity became central to his legal cases. The neighborhood around Gigante offered another path. Greenwich Village and nearby Italian communities contained gambling operations, bookmakers, social clubs, loan sharks, and crews connected to New York organized crime. His criminal record was already building before the Costello shooting. By age 25, he had been arrested 7 times. Later biographical accounts list charges involving fencing stolen goods, possession of an unlicensed firearm, auto theft, arson, and bookmaking, with one gambling case resulting in a 60-day jail sentence. Those encounters with law enforcement came before the 1957 attack that tied him publicly to the struggle between Frank Costello and Vito Genovese. During the same period, he became associated with Genovese, one of the most powerful mafia figures in the country. Genovese had spent years waiting for a chance to take control of the organization, then led by Frank Costello, a veteran boss whose influence rested on gambling, political relationships, and connections extending beyond street crews. Costello had survived the violent years that created the modern 5 families, and had remained near the top while other bosses were killed, deported, or imprisoned. By the middle of the 1950s, Genovese was ready to challenge him. The struggle between Costello and Genovese centered on control of the entire mafia family. Control of a mafia family meant authority over captains, soldiers, associates, gambling operations, labor relationships, loans, extortion, and criminal partnerships involving other organizations. A boss could influence which crews controlled profitable territory, how disputes were settled, who received support when business crossed family lines, and which people were protected when law enforcement pressure increased. Costello had built those relationships for years, while Genovese had his own loyal followers and a reputation for moving aggressively when power was available. Gigante was one of the younger men around Genovese during this period, and the event that permanently tied their names together happened on the night of May 2, 1957. Costello returned to his apartment building at 115 Central Park West in Manhattan and entered the lobby. A gunman approached and fired at close range. The bullet struck Costello near the head but failed to kill him, leaving him wounded while the attacker escaped. Federal law enforcement later identified Gigante as the gunman Genovese had sent to carry out the killing. The FBI's official history of La Cosa Nostra continues to describe Gigante as the man who shot Costello, and the attack became one of the most repeated events in accounts of his early criminal career. The courtroom result, however, never gave prosecutors the conviction that later retellings sometimes make easy to assume. Costello refused to identify Gigante as the shooter. Without the victim confirming the identity of the man who approached him, prosecutors faced a much weaker attempted murder case. Gigante was prosecuted, but was never convicted of shooting Costello. Some later histories describe the outcome as an acquittal, while the FBI history emphasizes that the case failed after Costello would not identify him. The safest conclusion is also the clearest. Federal investigators believed Gigante carried out the attack for Genovese. Costello survived, and the criminal prosecution did not establish Gigante's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction matters because the shooting became central to Gigante's reputation, even though it never became one of his convictions. The attack still changed the balance of power. Costello survived the bullet but soon stepped away from leadership, allowing Genovese to take the position he had wanted. The result created a strange outcome, in which the intended victim remained alive, the accused gunman avoided conviction, and the larger objective behind the shooting was still achieved. Genovese became the dominant figure in the organization that would eventually carry his name, while Gigante remained close enough to the new leadership for investigators to continue treating him as a serious organized crime figure. At 29, he had become publicly connected to one of the most important mafia power shifts of the decade, without receiving a conviction for the act that made his name recognizable. The failure of the Costello case also showed a problem that followed organized crime investigations for years. Prosecutors could know who belonged to a criminal organization and still struggle to prove one specific act in court. Witnesses feared retaliation, mafia members refused cooperation, and the people most capable of explaining an event often had reasons to remain silent. A shooting carried out in seconds could therefore become harder to prosecute than a longer conspiracy that left behind multiple participants, records, and conversations. Gigante's next major federal case would prove that difference. Federal investigators were pursuing a narcotics conspiracy involving Vito Genovese, Gigante, and other defendants. In 1959, Gigante was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Genovese was convicted as well. The narcotics prosecution succeeded where the Costello case had failed, because the government built a broader conspiracy case rather than depending on one wounded mafia boss identifying an attacker. Gigante now entered the federal prison system at a time when nobody had any reason to think the routine records created there would later become important evidence in the competency battles that delayed his federal prosecution for years. Gigante entered federal custody in 1960. His medical and work records from the following years described a man capable of functioning inside the institution. During an early medical history, he denied depression, excessive worry, memory loss, nightmares, and earlier psychiatric hospitalization. His mother, Yolanda, also provided information about his childhood and family background that did not describe the severe psychiatric history doctors would hear about later. Prison employees recorded physical complaints, but the files did not show the kind of serious mental impairment that would eventually become central to Gigante's criminal defense. He completed work assignments and received positive reports from people supervising him. The work records became especially important because they were ordinary. Prison employees were not investigating Gigante's future competency and were not trying to prove whether he belonged to the mafia. They were documenting how an inmate behaved while serving a federal sentence. Gigante was described as willing to work and capable of performing assigned tasks, while later reports continued to show satisfactory functioning. An intelligence test recorded an IQ around the normal range, and the prison history contained no special finding suggesting that he could not understand his environment. None of those records could predict every medical problem he might develop later, but they gave prosecutors and judges a useful starting point when claims of severe incapacity eventually appeared. Federal prison also placed Gigante inside a structured environment where daily behavior was observed by people with no role in his later defense. Meals, work, medical visits, discipline, and routine interactions created repeated chances for serious psychiatric symptoms to be noticed if they disrupted ordinary functioning. The absence of major psychiatric findings did not prove that mental illness could never develop later, and federal judges did not treat the records that way. Their value came from showing what was documented before competency offered any obvious legal advantage. When later doctors heard stories suggesting a much older history of severe disorder, these records gave courts something contemporary to compare those memories against. Gigante remained in prison, while Vito Genovese also served a federal sentence. Genovese would never return to the streets as a free man, yet the organization continued functioning through senior figures outside prison. That continuity taught a basic lesson about mafia structure. Removing one leader did not necessarily remove the hierarchy beneath him. Captains still supervised crews, money still moved upward, and trusted people could continue handling business. Gigante was released in 1964 and returned to New York, where he resumed a life tied to organized crime figures and to the Greenwich Village neighborhood that would later become the stage for his most famous public behavior. The first clear change in his psychiatric record appeared after his release. In October 1966, Gigante began regular treatment with psychiatrist Michael Scolaro. Later federal court findings considered the timing significant because it came around the period when Gigante had learned that law enforcement was again paying close attention to him. New Jersey investigators were examining organized crime and possible police corruption, including allegations that officers were being paid for information about investigations and surveillance. Gigante would eventually be accused of participating in that corruption by offering money to police officers in exchange for information useful to him and other organized crime figures. The timing alone could never prove that every symptom Gigante reported was false. Mental illness can begin after years of ordinary functioning, and physical illness can exist besides psychiatric problems. Gigante would later develop serious heart disease that nobody disputed. Some psychiatrists continued believing he suffered genuine mental problems even after prosecutors produced evidence of organized crime activity. The government's eventual case therefore had to be narrower. Prosecutors would argue that whatever genuine problems existed, Gigante also exaggerated or deliberately produced symptoms when the legal system was measuring whether he could stand trial. That distinction did not matter yet in the late 1960s, because prosecutors still lacked the private mafia evidence that would later make the contrast visible. Doctors saw a patient arriving for treatment and presenting symptoms that fit serious illness. Law enforcement saw a suspect connected to organized crime, but could not easily place an undercover observer inside the rooms where senior mafia figures discussed business. The two records developed separately, and for years, neither side had access to the full picture the other would eventually produce. The New Jersey investigation continued. In 1969, a Bergen County grand jury indicted Gigante on charges involving bribery and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Prosecutors alleged that money had been offered to law enforcement officers in exchange for information about criminal investigations. The case threatened Gigante in a different way from the narcotics prosecution, because it involved alleged efforts to protect organized crime activity by corrupting the people responsible for investigating it. His lawyers responded by raising a question that had played no role in the Costello case or the narcotics trial. They argued that he was mentally unable to stand trial. Doctors examined Gigante, reviewed the history available to them, and encountered a patient whose reported condition looked far worse than anything documented during his federal sentence. The legal focus shifted away from whether prosecutors could prove bribery and toward whether a criminal trial could legally happen at all. That difference was enormous. In the Costello case, a missing identification weakened the proof of one crime. In the New Jersey case, a finding of incompetence could stop the entire courtroom process before jurors ever heard the government's evidence. Competency law exists for a legitimate reason. A defendant must understand the basic nature of the proceedings and be able to assist the lawyers handling the defense. Someone incapable of doing that cannot receive a fair trial simply because prosecutors believe the charges are serious. Gigante's doctors, therefore, were not deciding whether he was a mafia figure or whether he had committed bribery. They were evaluating the patient presented to them, the medical history they had received, and his ability to participate in a criminal case. That framework gave medical evidence a role Gigante's earlier prosecutions had never required. The judge now had to decide whether the case could proceed using psychiatric evaluations, treatment history, family information, and the behavior doctors observed. A finding of incompetence would stop the prosecution until Gigante was considered capable of understanding the proceedings and assisting his lawyers. It would also place a formal competency decision into a medical record that future doctors and courts could review if he faced new charges. At that point, prosecutors did not have the later mafia testimony that would describe Gigante handling disputes, exercising authority, or taking precautions against surveillance. The court could only work with the evidence available in 1971. That made the competency hearing important on its own terms and gave any ruling lasting significance. If the judge accepted the psychiatric evidence, later prosecutors would inherit an established legal finding they could challenge only with a much fuller record than the government possessed at the time. By 1971, Gigante's history already contained the pieces of two different pictures. One showed the young boxer tied by federal investigators to the Costello shooting, followed by a narcotics conviction and years of ordinary prison work. The other showed a psychiatric patient whose lawyers said he could not understand or assist in a trial. A New Jersey judge now had to decide which evidence mattered for the case in front of him without the cooperating mafia captains, recordings, and leadership testimony that later courts would use. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The New Jersey case had become a fight over whether Gigante could be tried at all. In 1971, the court would have to decide that issue using a medical record that later prosecutors would spend years trying to challenge. Section 2. The competency ruling that changed everything. The Bergen County bribery case moved into psychiatric evaluation before it could reach a jury. Gigante had been receiving treatment for several years, and his lawyers argued that his mental condition made a criminal trial impossible. By 1971, the court had a growing medical history describing serious impairment, while federal prison records from earlier in the decade showed a different level of daily functioning. Competency focuses on the defendant's condition at the time of the legal proceedings. A person can have committed a crime and still be unable to stand trial if he cannot understand what is happening or meaningfully assist the lawyers defending him. The rule exists to keep courts from trying people who cannot participate in their own cases. Doctors evaluating Gigante were not being asked whether he belonged to the mafia or whether he had bribed anyone. They were being asked whether the patient in front of them could understand the charges, the courtroom, the lawyers, and the decisions required during a criminal trial. The family and medical history provided during this period became one of the major points of dispute decades later. Doctors heard descriptions of psychiatric difficulty reaching back much earlier in Gigante's life, while the records from federal prison had contained no similar story. In 1960, Gigante had denied depression, excessive worry, memory trouble, nightmares, and previous psychiatric hospitalization. His mother had also described a childhood without the severe psychiatric background later presented. The difference did not automatically prove deception, because medical histories can be incomplete and families can remember events differently over time, but federal judges eventually treated the conflict as one part of a much larger pattern. In 1970 and 1971, Judge Morris Malik held competency hearings in Bergen County. Psychiatrists Henry Davidson, Joseph Zigarelli, and George Cassidy examined Gigante for the proceeding and concluded that he was incompetent to stand trial based on the behavior and history presented to them. Hospital records from 1971 also described severe impairment, including an IQ test score of 55, and occasions when Gigante said he could not name 4 presidents since 1900, or state how many weeks were in a year. On June 11, 1971, Malek accepted the medical opinions. He later explained that no other factual witness evidence had been presented to give him a basis for a different result. The decision formally stopped the New Jersey prosecution and placed a judicial incompetency finding into the record that later doctors and courts would have to address. The ruling did something else that mattered years later. It fixed a date in the legal record. Prosecutors trying to understand Gigante's later behavior could now compare what he was supposedly capable of doing around 1971 with what mafia witnesses said he was doing during the same period. If the two pictures were sharply different, the government would have a concrete place to begin testing the medical history. The challenge was that most of the people who could explain his private criminal life in the early 1970s had no intention of helping law enforcement at the time. The later federal record makes clear why the 1971 ruling mattered for years afterward. Doctors who meet a patient years after an earlier competency decision naturally review the previous medical findings. A diagnosis or legal determination can become part of the history that shapes future evaluations, especially when the patient continues receiving treatment and entering hospitals. Gigante's psychiatric record expanded through repeated examinations and admissions, producing a large body of documentation that later prosecutors could not dismiss with one argument about a suspicious timeline. The problem was that another record was developing outside the hospitals. Later federal findings placed Gigante as a captain in the Genovese family by the late 1960s or early 1970s. That position carried specific responsibilities inside the family. A captain supervised soldiers and associates, collected money moving upward through the organization, settled disputes inside a crew, and represented that crew when problems reached other parts of the family. Mafia witnesses eventually described Gigante doing exactly the kind of work expected from someone holding that rank. One incident from the early 1970s involved a freight-related dispute touching Genovese and Colombo interests. The later federal court record used the matter as evidence that Gigante could understand competing criminal claims and help settle a problem affecting people in more than one organization. The exact details mattered less than the level of authority required. A man trusted to resolve a dispute between organized crime interests needed to know who was involved, what each side believed it was owed, and what kind of settlement other criminals would accept. That kind of responsibility also required continuity. A captain could not resolve one dispute and then forget the people, obligations, or decisions involved, because future business depended on everyone remembering what had been agreed. The role placed Gigante inside a system where reputation and memory mattered constantly. Prosecutors later used those ordinary requirements of mafia leadership to challenge descriptions of a man supposedly unable to follow basic legal proceedings. The argument depended on repeated conduct over time, not one dramatic meeting that could be explained away. None of that evidence was available to Judge Malik in 1971. The Mafia still operated under a much stronger code of silence, and federal prosecutors did not yet have the large group of cooperating captains, acting bosses, underbosses, and associates who would later describe Gigante's private behavior. Surveillance could show who met whom without always revealing what had been discussed. Doctors therefore evaluated the behavior visible to them, while Mafia members saw a different part of Gigante's life that remained almost completely unavailable to law enforcement. The separation continued through the 1970s. In public, Gigante's life appeared centered around psychiatric treatment, familiar Greenwich Village streets, his mother's apartment, and behavior that suggested serious confusion. He entered hospitals and created more medical documentation. People in the neighborhood would eventually become familiar with the sight of him walking in pajamas or a bathrobe, sometimes appearing distracted or unable to manage ordinary conversation. The public image made sense when viewed beside the psychiatric history already accepted by a judge. His private life was broader. Federal prosecutors later produced evidence that Gigante maintained a second household with Olympia Esposito and their children, a part of his family life that some doctors had not fully understood when evaluating how dependent he was on his mother and relatives. The government argued that moving between households, maintaining close relationships, and managing a private life outside the narrow public routine showed more functioning than the clinical picture suggested. The defense could answer that mentally ill people can still maintain families and routines, which meant no single fact settled the issue. The gap between those two lives mattered, because doctors depended heavily on what they could personally observe, and on histories supplied by the patient and family. A psychiatrist usually does not have federal agents following a patient into private meetings, or organized crime witnesses explaining what happened after an appointment. If Gigante behaved differently around criminal associates, that information could remain completely outside the medical file. Years later, prosecutors would argue that this missing outside evidence had shaped several early evaluations. Through much of the 1970s, the evidence needed to compare those two sides of Gigante's life remained difficult to obtain. Investigators could observe meetings, associations, and familiar locations, but seeing a suspected mafia figure enter a social club did not establish what he discussed or what authority he exercised inside. The medical record therefore continued growing without the kind of first-hand criminal testimony that could show doctors how Gigante functioned away from appointments and hospitals. Later cooperation would eventually give prosecutors a way across that gap. Once insiders began explaining who attended meetings, who settled disputes, and whose approval mattered, older surveillance and records could be read with new context. During the years immediately after the 1971 ruling, however, that evidence was still largely unavailable. The incompetency findings stood in the formal record while Gigante's private role continued developing inside an organization whose members had strong reasons to keep it hidden. The difference between those records did not require a conclusion that Gigante had no illness at all. Several psychiatrists believed he suffered from severe psychiatric problems, and some continued holding that view even after the government produced evidence of organized crime activity. Later experts also raised possible neurological problems, and Gigante's heart disease became serious enough to require major surgery. Federal judges eventually reached a narrower conclusion. They found that genuine health problems existed, while also concluding that Gigante deliberately produced or exaggerated psychiatric symptoms when legal competency was being evaluated. That distinction became necessary because the government's strongest argument was based on function. Gigante did not need to be perfectly healthy for prosecutors to prove that he understood far more than he showed doctors. If mafia witnesses could establish that he remembered complicated relationships, gave instructions, resolved disputes, understood surveillance, and exercised authority over other criminals, then the most extreme descriptions of total incapacity became harder to accept. The medical question shifted from whether he had any disorder to whether the disorder actually prevented him from understanding court proceedings. The 1971 ruling still protected him because later evidence had not yet been collected. Through the 1970s and early 1980s, law enforcement could suspect that Gigante's public behavior served a purpose without having enough admissible evidence to prove it. The medical record was large and legitimate on its face. Prosecutors faced trained doctors who had personally examined the defendant, while much of the evidence pointing the other way came from secretive criminal relationships that nobody inside the organization wanted to explain under oath. Gigante's own operating habits made that problem harder. Witnesses later described him worrying about surveillance and limiting unnecessary meetings. Associates learned to avoid using his name, sometimes referring to him indirectly, or touching the chin when they needed to identify him. Those rules reduced the chance that a recorded conversation would clearly place Gigante at the center of a criminal decision. His medical record created one kind of distance from prosecution, while the organization created another by making his authority difficult to capture in words. The approach also matched the structure of the Genovese family. A senior leader did not need to speak directly with every soldier or associate. Captains could collect money, pass instructions, and handle local problems. Only issues requiring higher approval had to move closer to the top. Every extra layer gave the boss another degree of separation from the conduct that might eventually appear in an indictment. For Gigante, that organizational distance existed beside the psychiatric history rather than replacing it. By the end of the 1970s, later evidence placed Gigante moving toward the senior leadership of the Genovese family. He had gone from captain toward the position of consigliere, placing him close to the top of an organization, with crews spread across New York, and criminal interests touching construction, labor, gambling, loans, and other businesses. The man a judge had found unable to stand trial was now being trusted with decisions requiring memory, judgment, and awareness on a regular basis. That rise explains why the 1971 decision mattered to prosecutors years later. The government had to understand how someone with a formal record of incapacity could continue advancing through a hierarchy where mistakes carried financial and sometimes violent consequences. Every later witness who described Gigante functioning privately made the old competency record more difficult to accept without closer examination. The significance of the psychiatric record also grew because it was cumulative. One doctor could rely partly on an earlier doctor's observations, and a later court could see repeated hospitalizations as evidence of a condition that had already been recognized by another judge. That is normal medical and legal practice when the earlier information is reliable. In Gigante's case, prosecutors would eventually argue that the process had been fed incomplete information from the beginning. To prove that, they needed evidence showing sustained private functioning across the same years, not merely suspicion that the timing looked convenient. The later federal competency case eventually expanded into a review of records, witnesses, and behavior across decades. The government had to reconstruct old prison records, family history, business disputes, mafia meetings, surveillance, and the testimony of people who had dealt with Gigante when no doctor was present. The defense could challenge every cooperator as a criminal seeking favorable treatment, while prosecutors could challenge the clinical picture as one built without access to the defendant's hidden life. The 1971 ruling sat at the center of that conflict because it was the first time Gigante's psychiatric presentation produced a direct legal barrier to prosecution. From then on, prosecutors would have to defeat that barrier before any jury could consider the underlying charges. That burden would grow every year the medical history expanded, while investigators were still trying to uncover the private evidence behind it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 1971 ruling became part of Gigante's medical history, while evidence of his private mafia role remained largely out of reach. By the middle of the decade, figures from other mafia families were coming into direct contact with the authority he exercised away from doctors and courtrooms. Section 3. The Boss Behind the Boss. In 1976, Sammy Gravano went to the Triangle Social Club on Sullivan Street over a construction dispute involving Genovese and Gambino interests. Gigante was a Genovese captain at the time. The meeting gave later prosecutors a specific example of how his private mafia role operated during the same years covered by his psychiatric history. The dispute involved Genovese member Vincent de Napoli. During the meeting, Gravano's captain, Toto Ariello, introduced another Genovese figure named Dom as a captain, and Gigante immediately corrected him, saying Dom had become the consigliere. Gigante then agreed to speak with de Napoli and straighten out the construction problem. The later federal court record states that he followed through and resolved it. The Triangle Social Club became one of the most important locations in Gigante's story because it sat only a short distance from the neighborhood where he lived and walked. To an outsider, it was another small social club in Greenwich Village. Inside the Genovese family, it was associated with a man whose authority kept growing. Signs inside warned members about informants and electronic listening, reflecting the constant fear of surveillance that shaped organized crime during this period. Gigante's later court record described the club as one of the places where he met mafia figures while trying to keep those meetings controlled and difficult for investigators to use. Gigante had already been functioning as a captain by the early 1970s. The position placed him above soldiers and associates, and made him responsible for resolving problems that could not be handled at street level. The earlier freight disputes cited in federal court showed that he was trusted to take part in decisions involving other organized crime interests. By the time Gravano came to Sullivan Street in 1976, that authority had grown enough for a Gambino figure to treat Gigante as someone capable of settling a construction issue affecting both organizations. Construction was especially important because mafia influence reached deeply into New York's building industry. Large projects brought contractors, unions, suppliers, trucking companies, concrete firms, and large amounts of money into the same network of legitimate business. Organized crime families could profit by influencing who received contracts, controlling labor, collecting payments, and settling disputes between companies connected to different organizations. A senior Genovese figure who could resolve those problems held a position with real economic value, even if his name never appeared on a contract. The structure of a mafia family made that kind of authority difficult to see from outside. Soldiers answered to captains, captains moved important issues upward, and senior leaders could remain several steps away from the people committing the most visible crimes. A bookmaker collecting bets, or an associate pressuring a contractor, might never speak directly to the boss. Money and information could pass through several trusted people before reaching the top. For investigators, proving leadership meant identifying whose decisions actually controlled the organization. Surveillance photographs could document meetings without establishing the chain of command by themselves. Gigante eventually became consigliere, placing him among the senior positions traditionally recognized near the top of a mafia family. The role involved advising leadership and helping settle disputes, but later federal findings concluded that his power went further. During the period when Anthony Fat Tony Salerno was widely identified by law enforcement and the public as the Genovese boss, Gigante had become the person operating above him. Salerno remained an important criminal in his own right, with major rackets and authority over other mafia members. The later conclusion concerned who had the final say when the most important decisions reached the top. The arrangement was effective because Salerno looked exactly like a major mafia boss. He was older, visible, deeply involved in profitable criminal businesses, and regularly observed around organized crime figures. Federal investigators had strong reasons to focus on him. Gigante could remain closer to Greenwich Village, maintain his psychiatric history, limit unnecessary appearances, and allow another powerful man to absorb much of the attention that came with being recognized as the family boss. The structure did not require Salerno to pretend he had no authority. He could exercise real power while still answering upward on the decisions that mattered most. That distinction later became important when courts reviewed old surveillance. If investigators heard Salerno discussing business, the natural conclusion was that they were hearing the boss. Only an insider could explain whether Salerno was acting on his own authority or carrying out a decision already approved by Gigante. Years later, cooperating witnesses supplied that missing explanation, allowing prosecutors to reinterpret evidence that had originally pointed toward a different leadership structure. Gigante's concern with surveillance became especially clear during discussions involving the Concrete Club, the system through which mafia families influenced major construction work in New York. Later witnesses described Gigante objecting to routine meetings among family bosses, because those gatherings gave federal agents valuable opportunities to identify leadership and record conversations. He preferred lower-ranking people to handle ordinary business whenever possible. A boss who appeared only for major decisions created fewer chances for investigators to capture the kind of direct command that could later become evidence in a racketeering case. The logic was simple and effective. Federal agents could photograph a meeting without hearing what was said, or they could record a conversation filled with indirect language that made little sense without an insider to explain it. If captains handled routine problems, the person at the top could remain several steps away from daily crimes. Money and decisions still moved through the organization, but the boss left fewer obvious connections between himself and the people collecting payments or making threats. The method also reduced the number of people who could later testify from first-hand knowledge about the boss. An August 1980 incident involving Peter Savino showed the level of men around Gigante. Savino was brought before a leadership group that included Gigante, Salerno, Bobby Mana, and other important Genovese figures after questions arose about Savino and his business dealings. The meeting later mattered because Savino became a government witness with first-hand knowledge of how the family leadership operated. At the time, he was still an associate moving through a criminal system where the people in that room could determine whether someone remained trusted, lost access to profitable work, or became a problem requiring attention. Savino's later cooperation gave prosecutors another person who could explain why Gigante's presence mattered. An outsider looking at surveillance might see several known mafia figures sitting together and assume Salerno, the publicly recognized boss, held the most authority. An insider could describe which man the others waited for, who settled the final dispute, and whose approval mattered when serious decisions were made. That kind of testimony eventually helped federal judges reinterpret evidence that had been collected years earlier without a clear understanding of the hierarchy. Gigante's rules about his name reinforced the same protection. Mafia witnesses described associates avoiding the words Vincent Gigante in conversation. When they needed to identify him, some used indirect phrases while others touched their chin, referring silently to the nickname that came from his given name. The rule was enforced strongly enough that people inside the family understood the risk of ignoring it. A recorded conversation could still reveal criminal activity, but keeping the boss's name out of the tape made it harder to connect the discussion to him without another witness explaining the code. The rule also changed ordinary communication inside the family. People who wanted Gigante's approval had to learn how to refer to him without creating a clear electronic record. That practice encouraged a culture where meaning depended on shared knowledge rather than explicit statements. For law enforcement, every missing name created another argument the defense could later raise about who a speaker really meant. For Gigante, the value came from making a simple sentence less useful in court. The psychiatric image worked beside those precautions. Gigante continued entering hospitals and appearing publicly in clothing that suggested he could barely manage ordinary life. Newspapers eventually turned the contrast into a recurring story, but for investigators, the problem was more serious than the image itself. A man who appeared mentally disabled in public could still be meeting mafia figures in private. Yet proving that difference required evidence from people who had strong reasons to remain silent. The public performance and the criminal communication rules protected different parts of the same leadership problem. The Genovese family had long valued leadership that stayed difficult to reach. Vito Genovese had continued influencing the organization from prison before his death, and later senior figures understood that direct visibility created legal risk. Gigante carried that instinct further by combining ordinary mafia secrecy with a medical history that could stop a trial even after an indictment. A front boss, coded references, limited meetings, trusted intermediaries, and psychiatric incapacity each created a separate obstacle between investigators and the person prosecutors later identified as the true leader. The commission made that protection even more important. New York's major mafia families used the commission to settle disputes and deal with issues affecting more than one organization. A Genovese boss might need to discuss leadership changes, construction, killings, or conflicts involving the Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. Those meetings created enormous investigative value because they could expose the structure federal prosecutors were trying to prove under racketeering law. They also created danger for any boss who appeared too often around other family leaders. By the early 1980s, the federal government had become much better at using the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act against organized crime. Prosecutors no longer needed to catch a boss personally collecting money from every racket. They could argue that he participated in the affairs of a criminal enterprise through a pattern of crimes committed by people below him. That change made the mafia hierarchy itself dangerous evidence, giving senior leaders even more reason to keep the chain of command unclear and to avoid being captured discussing routine criminal business. Gigante's method matched that legal threat. If prosecutors wanted to prove a racketeering enterprise, he could make the enterprise difficult to map. If they wanted tapes, he could reduce meetings and discourage the use of his name. If they eventually indicted him, decades of psychiatric records could force a separate fight over whether he could be tried. No single part of the system guaranteed safety, but each layer made the government's work slower, more expensive, and more dependent on witnesses willing to explain what outsiders could not see. The weakness in that system was the possibility that insiders might cooperate. As long as captains and associates stayed loyal, Gigante could rely on investigators seeing only fragments. Once people began talking, old tapes and meetings gained new meaning. Savino, Gravano, Vincent Cafaro, and other future witnesses would eventually help prosecutors identify the authority behind conversations that once looked incomplete. A gesture toward the chin could become evidence once someone under oath explained exactly who it meant. Another revealing detail came from the way Gigante discussed family membership. At a commission-level gathering, he said he did not want his sons inducted into the mafia. The comment could sound like a personal line he wanted to draw, but later events make it risky to romanticize. His son Andrew would eventually face federal charges connected to organized crime activity. The useful point is narrower. Gigante was participating in conversations about induction and succession with other senior mafia figures, conduct that fit the role witnesses said he held. By the middle of the 1980s, the structure around Gigante had settled into a pattern federal investigators still did not fully understand. Salerno had the visibility, criminal history, and public stature expected from a boss, while Gigante kept meetings limited and discouraged people from using his name. Both men could exercise real authority, yet the final hierarchy remained difficult to prove from surveillance alone. A case built from visible meetings could therefore identify powerful Genovese leaders and still leave uncertainty about which man held the last word. That problem became sharper as federal investigators collected more electronic evidence against New York's mafia families. Tapes could reveal rackets, relationships, and discussions, but a recording still depended on knowing what each speaker meant and which person had final authority. Gigante's system was strongest at exactly that point. The people around him could understand a gesture, an indirect reference, or a decision passed through intermediaries without stating the hierarchy clearly enough for an outsider to follow. His psychiatric history added another obstacle if prosecutors ever reached him directly. Even a strong organized crime case could be delayed by a separate question about whether he was mentally capable of standing trial. The combination of organizational distance, controlled communication, and years of medical records gave Gigante several layers of protection at the same time. By early 1985, those layers were about to face their biggest test as federal authorities prepared a case aimed at the visible leadership of the five families. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By early 1985, federal prosecutors were closing in on the mafia's visible leadership. As the commission arrests approached, one recorded Genovese conversation suggested that the public picture of who held power was incomplete. Section 4. The Mafia Crackdown That Missed the Real Boss. On February 6, 1985, federal surveillance recorded Anthony Salerno speaking with Genovese captain Giuseppe Sabato about the law enforcement pressure closing in on the family. The conversation later became important in Gigante's competency litigation because the men referred to the effort invested in maintaining the psychiatric image around him and the danger of losing the benefit of that work if he were caught. Less than 2 weeks later, federal authorities began making arrests in the investigation that became known as the Mafia Commission case. The February conversation mattered because it appeared before the later flood of cooperating witness testimony. Salerno and Sabato were not speaking for a courtroom audience decades afterward, and their words became part of the evidence judges used when deciding whether Gigante's public presentation had been maintained for strategic reasons. Like every coded mafia conversation, the recording still required context, but it gave prosecutors something independent of witnesses who might later be attacked as informants seeking leniency. The timing placed concern about Gigante's psychiatric image directly beside the period when federal pressure on the family's leadership was becoming most intense. The arrests also exposed the different kinds of protection surrounding senior mafia figures. Some depended on lawyers, some on loyal subordinates, some on avoiding direct conversations, and some on organizational structures that placed other people between them and street crimes. Gigante had all of those advantages, plus a long competency history. Even if investigators eventually gathered enough evidence to indict him, his lawyers could force the government into a medical battle before any racketeering jury heard the criminal case. That extra barrier, added another layer of protection to the hidden leadership arrangement, alongside the effort to keep his name off recordings. For federal investigators in 1985, the immediate priority was still the commission case already built against the men they could identify and prove. Prosecutors could not delay a major organized crime prosecution indefinitely while waiting for a perfect picture of every hierarchy. Salerno was a legitimate target whose own criminal conduct supported serious charges. The later discovery that Gigante stood above him demonstrates the limits of even a successful prosecution. Law enforcement can remove an important leader while the organization adapts around the loss and keeps its ultimate authority further from view. Gigante's absence from the commission indictment mattered because the prosecution was built to identify and punish New York's mafia leadership. The Genovese structure had kept its highest authority outside the central charge, while still giving investigators a real and powerful defendant to prosecute. The commission prosecution was designed to hit organized crime at its highest level. Federal prosecutors had spent years collecting wiretaps, surveillance, financial records, labor evidence, and information about construction rackets involving New York's major mafia families. Rather than prosecute another bookmaker or extortion collector, the government wanted to show that family bosses formed a governing body that settled disputes and coordinated criminal business. Racketeering law allowed prosecutors to combine different crimes into one case, built around the enterprise itself, making leadership relationships a central part of the evidence. Salerno was charged as the boss of the Genovese family. Carmine Persico represented the Colombo family. Anthony Corallo represented the Lucchese family. And other senior organized crime figures were included in the case. Paul Castellano, the Gambino boss, was also under intense federal pressure during the same period. The prosecution represented the government's strongest attempt yet to remove several top leaders in a single coordinated case, and the public presentation of the indictment depended on law enforcement having correctly identified who actually sat at the top of each organization. Gigante was not charged as the Genovese boss in that central commission case. At the time, investigators had strong reasons for treating Salerno as the family leader because he was powerful, visible, and deeply involved in criminal activity. The later federal record complicated that picture by concluding that Salerno had probably been acting under Gigante's authority. That finding came years afterward, when cooperating witnesses finally explained the internal structure and prosecutors could reinterpret surveillance that had once appeared to point clearly toward Salerno. The timing of Gigante's medical treatment during the arrest period drew particular attention. On February 19th, federal arrests connected to organized crime investigations began. The following day, Gigante entered St. Vincent's Hospital after reporting chest pain and a fainting episode. Salerno was arrested on February 25th. Gigante left St. Vincent's on February 27th, then entered a psychiatric hospital on March 4th, and remained there until March 18th. Later prosecutors included the sequence in the larger record concerning his public presentation and the way his medical history overlapped with periods of serious law enforcement pressure. Those dates cannot fairly be used to claim that the chest pain itself was invented. Gigante had serious cardiovascular disease that became well documented and eventually required valve replacement and later open heart surgery. The government did not need to prove that every hospital visit was false. Its argument depended on the combination of timing, psychiatric behavior, mafia evidence, and later testimony showing that Gigante could function privately at a level different from the image presented in public. Genuine physical illness and deliberate psychiatric exaggeration could exist at the same time. The commission trial moved forward against Salerno and the other defendants. Prosecutors used recordings and business evidence to explain how mafia families controlled construction and other rackets, while meeting through the commission to settle major issues. The case resulted in convictions against Salerno and several other senior figures, most of whom received 100-year federal sentences. The prosecution became one of the defining organized crime victories of the 1980s because it showed that federal law could reach bosses who had spent decades keeping distance from individual crimes. For the Genovese family, the public story appeared simple. The government had identified its boss, convicted him, and sentenced him to a term that effectively removed him from the streets for life. Later court findings surrounding Gigante showed why that conclusion was incomplete. Witnesses described Salerno as an important leader, with his own authority, while placing Gigante above him on the most important family decisions. Salerno had not been a powerless actor placed in front of an innocent man. He was a serious organized crime figure, operating below someone the government had failed to charge as the final boss. That difference mattered, because the commission case was specifically designed to remove the leadership of New York organized crime. Prosecutors succeeded against many of the men they targeted, but the structure around Gigante had created enough uncertainty for him to remain outside the case. The public boss title, limits on meetings, the rule against saying his name, trusted intermediaries, and the medical history all reduced the chance that one investigation would show the complete chain of command. Each element covered a weakness the others could not. The result also showed why front leadership could be more useful than simple secrecy. A completely invisible boss might create suspicion if everyone around him avoided obvious authority, while major decisions still required approval somewhere. Salerno gave investigators a believable answer to the question of who ran the family. He had the history, influence, wealth, criminal activity, and public presence expected from a boss. As long as nobody inside explained that a second layer existed, federal agents could build an accurate case against Salerno while still stopping short of Gigante. Gigante's position strengthened after Salerno was removed. Later federal findings concluded that he became the boss in title, as well as in fact after the 1985 arrests. The man who had once been a young boxer connected to Vito Genovese had now reached the top of the organization named after him, almost 30 years after the Costello shooting helped Genovese take control. The rise had happened slowly enough that federal prosecutors pursuing the commission had identified a powerful leader without reaching the person later found to hold final authority. The family still had to operate, while its public leadership faced enormous legal pressure. Captains continued running gambling, loans, construction interests, labor relationships, and other rackets, while Gigante relied on people below him to manage ordinary business. The fewer decisions that required his direct presence, the fewer chances investigators had to build evidence against him. The approach became more valuable as surveillance technology and cooperating witnesses made old mafia habits increasingly dangerous. Vincent Caffaro eventually became one of the Genovese captains who helped federal investigators understand the structure. His information added to the growing picture of Gigante as the hidden leader, while other witnesses from outside the family described meetings where Gigante acted with the authority of a boss. Each new cooperator reduced the value of the codes and indirect references that had worked when organized crime members refused to testify. A leadership system, designed to defeat electronic surveillance, became more vulnerable once insiders could explain the meaning behind what agents had already recorded. The commission convictions removed several older leaders and changed the balance of power across New York's mafia families. For the Genovese organization, the most important result was that Salerno's conviction did not remove the man later identified as the family's true boss. Gigante remained outside the Central Commission prosecution, and the structure that had kept his authority difficult to see was still functioning after one of the largest federal attacks on mafia leadership in decades. Salerno's conviction also showed why the earlier arrangement had been useful. Federal agents had not invented his importance. He controlled major rackets, attended significant meetings, and held enough authority to make him a central figure in a racketeering case. The missing piece was the level above him. Later witnesses described Gigante as the person whose approval mattered on the most serious Genovese decisions. The commission case therefore punished a powerful leader without fully exposing the hierarchy prosecutors were trying to dismantle. That distinction mattered after the arrests, because the family still needed someone to settle disputes, approve major decisions, and manage relationships with the other families. Gigante's position became more important as older figures disappeared into federal custody. Captains could continue handling gambling, loans, construction interests, labor relationships, and other rackets, while only the most serious matters had to move toward the top. The same layers that had limited his exposure before the commission case could continue operating afterward. The government's success also changed the risks surrounding every remaining boss. Federal prosecutors had shown that they could combine wiretaps, enterprise evidence, and crimes committed by subordinates into a case reaching senior leadership. Meetings between bosses now carried even more danger because one recorded discussion could help prove relationships among several families at once. Gigante's preference for limited contact and indirect communication fit the new environment well. The less often he appeared in a room with other senior figures, the fewer opportunities investigators had to place him inside decisions affecting multiple organizations. Cooperating witnesses would eventually weaken that protection. A tape that seemed incomplete could become much more useful when an insider explained who a speaker meant, why a meeting had been called, and whose approval had been required. The commission prosecution had already shown the power of electronic evidence. Until insiders began explaining the hierarchy, agents could know that a meeting mattered without being able to show exactly where final authority sat. That distinction would become crucial in later prosecutions. The next stage of the government's effort against Gigante would depend increasingly on people who could translate the hidden structure around those recordings. The mafia itself was also entering a period of leadership change. Several established bosses were facing prison, appeals, or the loss of day-to-day control. That instability made commission rules more important because each family still depended on agreements involving territory, shared rackets, and the treatment of other bosses. A leadership dispute inside one family could therefore become a problem for every surviving senior figure if it threatened the rules used to keep conflicts contained. Gigante entered that period with greater formal authority inside the Genovese family, and with fewer older commission figures around him. The public image remained the same. He was still associated with psychiatric treatment, Greenwich Village walks, and behavior that suggested severe impairment. Inside organized crime, later evidence placed him in the group expected to deal with decisions that could affect more than one family. The difference between those two roles was about to matter in a new way. By the end of 1985, the commission prosecution had exposed how much federal pressure could remove visible leadership while leaving deeper questions about Genovese authority unresolved. Gigante remained outside the central case, but the arrests had changed the balance among the families and reduced the number of older bosses available to enforce commission rules. That uncertainty mattered beyond the courtroom, because the surviving leaders still had to manage disputes and protect agreements across family lines. The arrests had weakened the old balance, leaving the remaining bosses to enforce commission rules in a more unstable environment. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The commission case removed several visible mafia leaders while Gigante remained outside the central prosecution. Within months, an unauthorized boss killing in the Gambino family created a leadership crisis the surviving commission figures could not ignore. Section 5. The Secret War Against John Gotti. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti stepped from their car outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan and were shot before reaching the door. John Gotti took control of the Gambino family after the killings, becoming the new boss of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. The takeover was also a direct challenge to the rules that had governed relations between New York's mafia families for decades, because Castellano had been killed without formal commission approval. The rule against killing a boss without permission had practical value. A family leader controlled crews, business interests, and relationships that reached into other organizations. Removing him could damage agreements involving construction, gambling, unions, loans, and shared criminal ventures. Commission approval gave the other families a chance to decide whether a leadership change would be accepted before violence created a larger conflict. Gotti's decision bypassed that system and forced other senior mafia leaders to decide how they would respond. Gigante had become the Genovese boss after Salerno's arrest, placing him at the level where a response to Gotti would be discussed. Lucchese leaders also had reasons to support action against the new Gambino boss. Federal prosecutors later presented evidence that Gigante and others participated in a conspiracy to murder Gotti, and the jury at Gigante's 1997 trial ultimately found that conspiracy proved as part of the racketeering case. The conflict unfolded while the two bosses developed completely different public images. Gotti appeared outside courthouses in expensive suits, spoke to reporters, attracted crowds, and became one of the most photographed mafia figures in American history. Several early prosecutions failed to convict him, producing the Teflon Don nickname and feeding the impression that he could survive anything prosecutors brought against him. Gigante continued appearing in Greenwich Village in pajamas, slippers, robes, and ordinary clothing associated with the psychiatric condition already documented for years. The public difference made the conflict easy to turn into a personality story, but later court evidence gave it a firmer foundation. Gotti had taken the boss position after an unauthorized killing. Gigante represented a leadership system that considered that act a serious violation. The resulting conspiracy belonged to the politics of organized crime rather than an invented personal rivalry. Senior mafia figures could oppose Gotti even if they rarely met him socially, because his takeover affected the rules protecting every family boss. The commission's authority was already under pressure from federal prosecutions. Several older leaders had been arrested, convicted, or were facing trials that could remove them permanently. Gotti's move therefore arrived during a transition in which the old governing system had fewer experienced bosses available to enforce its decisions. For a leader like Gigante, allowing the Castellano killing to pass without consequence could weaken a rule that also protected him from the same kind of unauthorized challenge inside his own family. The violence surrounding the dispute became visible in April 1986. Frank DeCicco, the Gambino underboss who had supported Gotti's rise, was killed when a bomb exploded near a car outside a Brooklyn social club. Contemporary investigators considered revenge for Castellano's murder as one theory. Later mafia accounts connected the bombing to the wider conflict involving the Genovese and Lucchese families. Gigante was never convicted of ordering DeCicco's bombing, so the event belongs in the documented background of the conflict, without being turned into a crime legally established against him. That legal limit matters because later, mafia testimony can easily blur the difference between what insiders said happened and what a jury actually proved. Cooperators sometimes described events from memory years after the fact, and several had participated in serious crimes themselves. Their testimony could be powerful when it matched other evidence, but it still had to be tested in court. The DeCicco bombing, therefore, remains important context for the struggle around Gotti, without becoming a substitute for the specific conspiracy finding returned against Gigante. Gotti survived the period and continued leading the Gambino family. Federal evidence later described several plans aimed at killing him. One effort failed after law enforcement learned enough from electronic surveillance to warn Gotti that his life was in danger. Another involved information moving through people around Lucchese, acting boss Alphonse D'Arco. The planned killing never occurred, because arrests and changing circumstances disrupted the effort before it could be carried out. The failure of those plans did not prevent prosecutors from charging the conspiracy years later. Conspiracy law focuses on the agreement and actions taken toward carrying out the plan, which means the intended victim does not need to be killed for the offense to exist. At Gigante's 1997 trial, the jury found that he had participated in the conspiracy to murder Gotti and others, and that the agreement continued into January 1988. A later legal ruling removed a separate standalone Gotti conspiracy count because it had been filed outside the applicable statute of limitations. Enough time had passed that prosecutors could no longer maintain that individual charge. The broader racketeering finding remained, leaving a result that requires careful wording. The later limitations ruling removed the standalone Gotti conspiracy conviction. The jury's finding that the Gotti murder conspiracy had been proved as part of the racketeering enterprise remained in place. That distinction illustrates how the final record in a long organized crime case can differ from the story told during trial. Jurors can find conduct proved as part of racketeering, while a separate count fails for a legal reason such as timing. The underlying factual finding does not disappear, yet the defendant's formal convictions must still be described accurately. For Gigante, the Gotti conspiracy remained one of the strongest pieces of evidence placing him in decisions made at the highest level of mafia authority. One commission meeting described by Sammy Gravano gave prosecutors a memorable picture of Gigante during the same period. Gravano testified that Gigante attended wearing pajamas or clothing similar to the public outfit already associated with his psychiatric image. The clothing drew attention because of what other witnesses had seen on Greenwich Village streets, yet Gravano described Gigante following the discussion and behaving normally during mafia business. The meeting included a conversation involving sons and mafia membership. Gotti spoke about his son entering organized crime, while Gigante expressed that he did not want his own sons inducted. The comment should not be turned into proof that Gigante wanted to separate his family from criminal life because his son Andrew would later become involved in a federal extortion prosecution. The useful detail is that Gigante was discussing family membership and succession with another mafia boss, behavior that prosecutors later compared with the severe incapacity presented to doctors. Gigante's clothing therefore became misleading when separated from what witnesses said he was actually doing. A bathrobe on Sullivan Street supported the public image of confusion, while the same clothing inside a mafia meeting did not prevent him from understanding who was present or what business was being handled. Prosecutors eventually argued that the performance worked because observers focused on the visible sign of illness while missing the level of function underneath it. The outfit also created a form of consistency. A man who appeared confused only when entering court might draw immediate suspicion, while someone who dressed and behaved strangely around the neighborhood for years could create the impression that the condition followed him everywhere. Later federal findings concluded that the public behavior formed part of the effort to support the psychiatric story. That did not require every person who saw him on the street to understand what purpose the behavior might serve. The Gotti conspiracy placed Gigante in decisions involving leadership across family lines. A captain could oversee gambling or loans inside one territory. A plan to kill another family boss required coordination among senior figures who had authority to speak for their own organizations. At the 1997 trial, the jury found that Gigante had joined that conspiracy, giving the government a specific finding tied to his role in high-level mafia decisions. It also exposed the limits of hiding behind intermediaries. Gigante could reduce the number of direct conversations he held, but a commission-level decision still involved people from other families. Every additional participant created another person who might later cooperate. The importance of the Gotti issue meant it could not be handled entirely by low-ranking figures without senior approval, making the conspiracy vulnerable once insiders such as Gravano and De Arco began talking to federal prosecutors. Gotti eventually faced a prosecution his public image could not defeat. Sammy Gravano, his own underboss, began cooperating with federal authorities and supplied detailed information about Gambino leadership and mafia relationships. Gotti was convicted in 1992 and received a life sentence. Gravano's testimony also became useful in cases involving leaders from other families because he had attended meetings and disputes that gave him first-hand knowledge of men federal agents had struggled to understand from surveillance alone. Darko's cooperation created a similar problem from the Lucchese side. As an acting boss, he had access to discussions far above the street level where ordinary associates operated. His testimony could connect proposed violence to senior leadership and explain how information moved between families. For prosecutors building a case against Gigante, witnesses from different organizations were especially valuable because the defense could not dismiss the entire story as one internal Genovese dispute. The growing number of cooperators created a serious weakness in Gigante's system. His precautions had been built for an organization where people refused to explain the meaning of coded conversations. Once insiders began testifying, a chin gesture, an indirect phrase, or a meeting captured years earlier could be placed into context. The government could take evidence that had once looked incomplete and combine it with a witness who knew which person actually held final authority. The government later used the contrast between Gotti and Gigante carefully. Visibility by itself did not make Gotti a criminal, and strange public behavior by itself did not prove Gigante was faking illness. What mattered was how those public styles interacted with evidence of authority. Gotti's public appearances made it easier to observe the people around him, while Gigante's routines encouraged investigators to question whether he could even manage ordinary affairs. Once cooperators described both men participating in high-level mafia business, the difference in public presentation became evidence about method rather than personality. The conspiracy evidence also showed how organized crime decisions could survive repeated failed attempts. A plan could be discussed, delayed, abandoned after an FBI warning, and revived through different people without ever producing a completed killing. For prosecutors, that made chronology important. They had to show that the agreement continued into the period charged and connect Gigante to that ongoing purpose. The jury's finding that the conspiracy lasted into January 1988 supplied that connection, while the later statute of limitations ruling showed why the exact date still mattered years afterward. The failed plans against Gotti left a record that reached beyond the immediate threat to one Gambino boss. The conspiracy had involved senior figures from several families, so knowledge of the discussions was spread across people who did not answer to the same hierarchy. That mattered because the Genovese system worked best when outsiders could see only fragments. A decision discussed across family lines created several separate fragments, each capable of gaining meaning if one participant later chose to cooperate. That cross-family exposure weakened one of Gigante's strongest protections against surveillance. A Genovese conversation could remain ambiguous when outsiders did not understand the hierarchy, but a decision involving several families created overlapping meetings, contacts, and witnesses. Investigators could compare dates, surveillance, and accounts from people connected to different organizations. As federal cases removed senior mafia figures, those separate pieces became easier to place beside one another, giving prosecutors a way to reconstruct decisions that had once looked incomplete. That problem became more serious as former insiders began giving federal investigators context that surveillance alone could not supply. Gravano could describe commission relationships from the Gambino side, while D'Arco could explain Lucchese leadership and discussions involving violence. Their accounts gave prosecutors two separate paths into events that Gigante's own family had tried to keep indirect. Cooperators could explain the purpose of meetings and connect plans to the people who approved them, adding context that surveillance had previously lacked. The value of coded language fell sharply once witnesses could identify the people and decisions behind it. The Gotti conflict therefore left prosecutors with evidence about Gigante's authority, even though the planned killing never occurred. It showed how a decision involving another family boss required participation at a level far above ordinary street rackets. It also showed the weakness in a system built around silence. Once men who had attended senior meetings began cooperating, the government could revisit older conversations and place Gigante inside a hierarchy that had once been difficult to see. That growing witness problem would soon intersect with a separate investigation built around money, labor, and repeated business dealings. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the Gotti conflict unfolded, a separate federal investigation was tracing money through public housing window contracts, union relationships, and recorded conversations. That business trail would give prosecutors another way to build a case around Gigante's authority. Section 6. The Windows Racket, where the money actually came from. For thousands of New York City residents, replacing broken or outdated apartment windows was ordinary public maintenance. Housing developments needed new frames and glass, contractors wanted the work, manufacturers competed for orders, and union workers handled installation. The business looked far removed from mafia politics. Federal prosecutors eventually showed that organized crime had found a way into that system, using labor influence and contractor relationships to turn public window projects into a profitable racketeering operation. The scheme involved Local 580 of the Architectural and Ornamental Ironworkers, a union representing workers used on window installation and related construction. Union control could affect whether a contractor completed a job smoothly or faced delays, higher costs, labor problems, or pressure over which workers were allowed on a site. Companies receiving favorable treatment could gain an advantage over competitors, especially when large public contracts were awarded through bids, where small differences in cost could decide who won the work. Prosecutors described a system in which organized crime influenced union officials and contractors through illegal payments, labor favors, pressure, and agreements designed to protect certain companies. Genovese and Lucchese interests overlapped in the industry, making the racket another business where senior leaders from different families needed to cooperate. Gigante and Lucchese boss Vittorio Amuso were eventually identified by federal prosecutors as important figures in the scheme. The value of the racket came from repetition. A murder could protect a family or remove a rival, but a construction business could generate money contract after contract. Public housing projects continued, contractors needed labor, and windows still had to be manufactured and installed. Organized crime influence could quietly produce income without the public attention created by shootings outside restaurants or car bombings. That steady flow of money helps explain why labor racketeering remained valuable even when it looked less dramatic than other mafia crimes. A contractor operating inside that environment could face pressure from several directions at once. Union rules affected labor costs. Organized crime relationships could determine whether a job proceeded without trouble, and competing companies might already be connected to people capable of influencing the bidding process. The result gave mafia-backed businesses advantages that ordinary competitors could not easily match. The scheme therefore reached beyond one illegal payment and into the conditions under which legitimate companies competed for public work. Peter Savino understood that system from the inside. He had spent years around Genovese figures and had already appeared before a leadership group that included Gigante and Salerno in 1980. His relationships placed him close enough to the window business to know which companies mattered, how labor problems were handled, and which organized crime figures stood behind decisions that might look ordinary on paper. By the late 1980s, that knowledge made him useful to federal investigators in a way that a single outside surveillance team could never be. In 1987, Savino began cooperating with federal authorities. He remained in contact with people tied to the racket while secretly recording conversations for investigators. Over roughly 18 months, those recordings supplied prosecutors with evidence that could be matched against business records, surveillance, union relationships, and testimony from other people. The tapes became especially useful because Savino could explain the meaning of conversations that an outsider might not understand. Mafia discussions rarely sounded like formal business meetings where everyone announced his title and described the crime in complete sentences. People used nicknames, partial references, familiar names, and indirect language because the participants already knew the background. Savino could tell investigators why a certain contractor mattered, who had authority over a labor issue, and which senior figure needed to approve a decision before people below him moved forward. His value came from translating the structure behind the words. The investigation also showed how federal racketeering cases were becoming harder for mafia leaders to avoid. Prosecutors could combine labor payments, extortion, business relationships, and organized crime hierarchy into one enterprise case rather than treating every transaction as an isolated offense. A boss did not need to appear at a job site or personally threaten a contractor if witnesses and records could show that the system operated under his authority. For Gigante, the same distance that protected him from direct contact now had to survive a case designed specifically to work through layers of an organization. The investigation eventually became large enough for federal prosecutors to bring a sweeping case. On May 30, 1990, authorities announced a 69-count indictment involving 15 defendants. Gigante was named in 35 counts, while the indictment alleged 109 racketeering acts across the enterprise. The charges described extortion, illegal labor payments, bid-related corruption, organized crime influence, and other conduct connected to the Windows operation. Those numbers represented accusations rather than proof. An indictment shows what prosecutors believe they can establish in court, but guilt still requires a conviction or plea. The distinction became especially important for Gigante because his case did not move forward with the other defendants. Once his lawyers raised competency, the court had to separate his prosecution, while doctors evaluated whether he was legally capable of standing trial. The other Windows defendants continued through the system. By late 1991, several had been convicted or had pleaded guilty, allowing prosecutors to establish much of the criminal structure around the racket, while Gigante remained outside the main trial. The delay showed how useful competency litigation could be, even without dismissing a single charge. A defendant did not need an acquittal if the court could not yet decide whether a trial was legally possible, and every month of delay placed more distance between the indictment and the events prosecutors hoped to prove. Time could damage both sides. Witnesses might forget details, become unavailable, or die, while physical evidence could become harder to explain years after it was collected. Defendants could also suffer genuine changes in health that created new competency questions, unrelated to whatever had happened earlier. At the same time, delay gave prosecutors more opportunity to gather cooperating witnesses and compare their stories against existing recordings. Gigante's case would eventually show both effects. Additional cooperators strengthened the government's understanding of the racket. Peter Chiodo, a Lucchese captain who had been involved in the window case, eventually became a witness after surviving an attempt on his life. His testimony helped explain how Lucchese leadership and Genovese interests interacted in the industry. The government's evidence no longer depended on one insider describing one corner of the operation, and witnesses from different families could be compared against one another. Savino supplied one of the most memorable accounts connecting Gigante directly to the business. According to Savino's sworn testimony, Gigante took him into a restroom during a private discussion about the Windows operation and turned the sink on full so the running water would make the conversation harder to overhear. Savino said Gigante discussed the business and told him to spread the word that he was crazy. The account needs to remain attached to Savino because no public recording independently captures the restroom conversation. Its value came from the behavior he described. Gigante was presented as someone worried about surveillance, careful enough to mask a private conversation with running water, able to discuss details of a profitable racket, and concerned with how other people described his mental condition. Federal judges later considered testimony like this, while deciding whether the medical image matched his private level of function. The running water also fit the wider pattern witnesses described. Gigante discouraged ordinary boss meetings, limited the use of his name, and relied on people below him to carry information. Turning on a sink during a sensitive conversation was a small version of the same instinct. The goal was to reduce what an unseen listener could capture and understand. Savino's later cooperation reversed that protection because the person inside the room became the one explaining the conversation. The government's evidence showed why controlling labor mattered economically. A contractor following normal union rules had to include wages, benefits, staffing requirements, and other labor costs in a bid. A company receiving illegal advantages could lower expenses or avoid problems that competitors still had to face. Organized crime influence, therefore, affected the competitive process without requiring a mafia figure to steal a city payment directly. The money came from manipulating how legitimate business operated. The scheme also gave senior organized crime leaders a reason to coordinate. If Genovese interests controlled one part of the labor relationship and Lucchese figures controlled another, conflict between the families could disrupt a profitable arrangement for everyone. Cooperation protected the racket and allowed money to move through companies and union relationships without constant internal disputes. That is why testimony identifying Gigante and Amuso as central figures mattered. It placed the alleged bosses above a business requiring cross-family stability. By 1993, prosecutors filed a more focused superseding indictment against Gigante. The newer case combined important Windows charges with murder conspiracy allegations involving John Gotti, Peter Savino, and several older mafia killings. The enormous 1990 prosecution had now become a case centered on the man the government believed stood at the top of the Genovese family. The charges linked money, violence, and leadership, turning the eventual trial into a broader racketeering case centered on Gigante's authority. The financial charges remained essential because they showed what leadership was protecting. The organization made money through businesses where workers, contractors, and residents might never see the mafia figure benefiting from the arrangement. A union official could receive an illegal payment, a contractor could gain an advantage, and a captain could settle a dispute while the boss remained several levels removed. When Gigante finally reached trial in 1997, the jury convicted him of extortion conspiracy and conspiracy to make illegal labor payments tied to the Windows operation. Those findings transformed part of the original prosecution theory into established criminal responsibility. The jury did not accept every allegation prosecutors presented in the broader case, which makes the Windows verdict especially useful because it identifies the parts that survived full courtroom testing. The verdict also showed why the government had spent years preserving the business evidence while the competency fight continued. Murder allegations built from old mafia conflicts could depend heavily on witnesses remembering events from long before. The Windows case contained a more recent pattern of dealings involving identifiable companies, union relationships, recordings, and participants who could describe how the system worked. That gave jurors several kinds of evidence to compare, rather than one disputed account of a single violent act. Savino's cooperation created a growing risk because the Windows case depended on relationships that repeated over time. Contractors returned for new work, union problems had to be settled, payments moved through familiar channels, and the same people appeared in disputes more than once. An insider who understood those patterns could help investigators connect separate events that might otherwise look like ordinary business problems. The danger came from the amount of context Savino carried, not from one recording by itself. His access also reached beyond the mechanics of Local 580. Savino had dealt with senior Genovese figures and could describe how authority moved upward when a problem required approval. That made his testimony useful for explaining why Gigante mattered to a construction racket, even when the boss was several steps removed from a contractor or union payment. The government could compare Savino's account with recordings, business records, surveillance, and testimony from people on the Lucchese side of the scheme. The same access made secrecy harder to maintain. Gigante's precautions worked best when outsiders could hear fragments without knowing what they meant. Savino could supply the missing meaning. He knew which people carried messages, which meetings were important, and how a conversation about labor or contractors fit into the larger hierarchy. Once investigators had that kind of witness, avoiding a boss's name on tape offered less protection because someone inside the system could identify the authority behind the discussion. That problem also reached the psychiatric case. Savino described Gigante discussing business and taking precautions against surveillance during years when doctors were receiving a much different picture of his daily functioning. His account did not settle the medical question by itself, but it gave prosecutors another source of evidence about how Gigante behaved away from examinations. The government could place that private conduct beside the clinical record and ask doctors and judges to consider both. By the time the Windows prosecution developed around Gigante, Savino had become useful in two connected ways. He could explain the money and labor relationships at the center of the racketeering case, and he could describe private behavior relevant to the long competency dispute. His cooperation therefore gave prosecutors a witness who linked ordinary business evidence to the family hierarchy and linked that hierarchy to Gigante's private behavior during the competency years. That combination made his testimony important to both the racketeering case and the medical dispute that had kept the prosecution from reaching a jury. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Windows investigation had given prosecutors an insider who understood both the racket and Gigante's private behavior. Keeping that witness alive and available long enough to testify would become a separate problem. Section 7. The witness Gigante wanted gone. Peter Savino had spent years close enough to the Genovese family to understand how quickly a trusted relationship could become a threat. He knew the window industry, moved around people connected to organized crime, and had been brought before senior Genovese figures long before he ever agreed to help the government. By the time he began cooperating in 1987, he possessed the kind of knowledge federal investigators rarely received from someone who could still move through active criminal relationships. Savino's value came from explaining evidence that investigators could already collect through documents and electronic surveillance. He could identify who controlled a business relationship, why one contractor mattered, how a union problem connected to organized crime, and which people had the authority to settle disputes. That context mattered when prosecutors had to connect a recorded conversation to the people and decisions behind it. His explanations turned fragments into a structure and gave prosecutors a way to compare the language on recordings with the hierarchy witnesses described. That structure extended upward to Gigante. Savino had seen senior Genovese leaders together, understood the importance of the Triangle Social Club, and later described private conversations involving the Windows operation. His testimony gave prosecutors something different from the public image of a confused man walking through Greenwich Village. He described a person capable of discussing business, controlling who knew what, and taking precautions against surveillance. Other people inside organized crime eventually became suspicious of Savino. Federal court findings later described Genovese and Lucchese figures questioning whether he had become an informant, yet some were hesitant to act because they believed Gigante still protected him. The delay showed how internal authority could restrain violence as well as order it. A suspected cooperator was dangerous, but killing someone connected to a senior leader without permission could create another problem inside the organization. The uncertainty around Savino also shows why mafia violence was not always automatic. People inside the family could suspect a betrayal and still wait for authorization because acting without approval risked punishment of its own. A captain or soldier who moved too quickly might kill someone the boss still considered useful or loyal. In a hierarchy built around obedience, the decision about when suspicion became a death sentence could itself reveal who held final authority. Once Gigante accepted the belief that Savino was cooperating, the protection disappeared. Prosecutors later charged Gigante with participating in a conspiracy to murder him, and the 1997 jury found that conspiracy proved. The agreement continued into the early 1990s. Savino remained alive because federal authorities moved him into the Witness Protection Program, placing him somewhere people searching for him could not easily reach. Witness protection changed the ordinary facts of Savino's life. He could no longer move through the businesses, neighborhoods, and relationships that had made him useful to investigators. His location had to remain secret. Contact with people from his old life became dangerous, and every future court appearance required planning around the possibility that organized crime figures still had reason to find him. Cooperation protected him from one threat by forcing him to give up much of the life he had known. For prosecutors, keeping Savino alive also protected years of investigative work. A dead witness could leave behind recordings, but the defense could challenge their meaning without the person who made them available to explain the context. Savino could identify speakers, describe relationships, and answer questions about what happened before and after a recorded conversation. His testimony therefore gave the government a bridge between the raw evidence and the criminal structure it wanted a jury to understand. The delay in Gigante's prosecution made that burden longer. Savino began helping the government in 1987, but Gigante would not face a jury until 1997. During those 10 years, other Windows defendants were prosecuted. Mafia members from several families began cooperating, and courts spent years deciding whether Gigante was competent to stand trial. Savino remained one of the witnesses prosecutors needed, even as time and illness changed his circumstances. His account of the restroom conversation became especially important because it placed several parts of the case together in one moment. Savino testified that Gigante brought him into a restroom while discussing the Windows business, turned on the sink to cover the sound, and told him to help spread the idea that he was crazy. The government used the account as evidence that Gigante understood surveillance risks and treated the psychiatric image as something useful to maintain. The defense had strong reasons to attack Savino. He had been involved in criminal activity, had agreed to cooperate, and depended on the government for protection. A witness in that position could hope for favorable treatment or feel pressure to provide information prosecutors wanted. Gigante's lawyers therefore challenged his credibility and forced the jury to consider whether a man with his history should be trusted. The government tried to answer that problem by showing where Savino's testimony overlapped with other evidence. The Windows recordings existed independently of his later courtroom appearance. Other Mafia witnesses described Gigante worrying about surveillance and operating at a high level inside the family. Prison records and medical history created their own timeline. Savino's account became one part of a larger picture rather than the only evidence prosecutors had. This overlap mattered because cooperating witnesses are often strongest when they explain evidence that already exists. A jury does not have to accept every memory simply because a former criminal takes the stand. It can compare the account against tapes, dates, business records, and testimony from people who reached the same events from different directions. Gigante's trial eventually produced exactly that kind of test, and the mixed verdict showed that jurors did not accept every accusation placed before them. By 1997, Savino was also dying. He had terminal, inoperable cancer, and remained at a protected location that could not safely be disclosed. The government still needed his testimony, but transporting him to Brooklyn created serious medical and security problems. The court therefore faced a conflict between Gigante's right to confront a witness and the unusual condition of a dying man whose location had been hidden because people connected to the defendant had once conspired to kill him. Judge Jack Weinstein allowed Savino to testify through a live two-way closed-circuit video system. Savino could see the courtroom, and the people in court could see him. He testified under oath in real time while Gigante's lawyers questioned him, challenged his criminal history, and attacked his cooperation agreement. The location remained secret, but the defense still had the opportunity to cross-examine the witness before the jury. The procedure was unusual enough to become an issue on appeal. Criminal defendants normally have a strong constitutional right to confront witnesses face-to-face, and the government cannot replace live testimony with a screen simply because it is more convenient. Savino's case involved terminal illness, a protected location, and documented security concerns tied to the murder conspiracy. Those conditions gave the court reasons that went well beyond convenience. Gigante later appealed the use of the video procedure. The Second Circuit upheld the decision because the circumstances were exceptional, and the defense had still been able to challenge Savino directly. The court did not turn remote testimony into a routine substitute for an in-person witness. It treated the arrangement as a response to a protected witness with terminal cancer whose physical appearance in court created serious difficulties. Savino's position also gave the jury a direct view of the human cost created by a murder conspiracy that never succeeded. He was alive, but the survival came with secrecy, relocation, government protection, and the danger that revealing his location could expose him to the people who had once wanted him found. The legal term conspiracy can sound abstract until the intended victim is the person giving evidence from an undisclosed place because the threat never completely disappeared. The jury's treatment of Savino matters because it did not accept every murder allegation in the case. Prosecutors presented several older killings as racketeering acts connected to Gigante. Jurors rejected some of those claims and could not agree on others. The Savino conspiracy was one of the violent allegations they did find proved, showing that they had separated the evidence rather than simply accepting every accusation against a mafia boss. That mixed approach strengthens the importance of the Savino finding. Jurors willing to reject other murder claims still accepted the government's evidence that Gigante joined a plan to kill this particular witness. The verdict, therefore, cannot fairly be dismissed as a general reaction to Gigante's reputation. It reflects a specific decision about the proof surrounding Savino. Savino survived the conspiracy long enough to tell a jury what he knew. That outcome gave witness protection a practical meaning beyond a government program name. The people who wanted him found could not reach him, while prosecutors preserved his evidence until the case finally reached trial. His cooperation had turned a profitable construction racket into a path toward the senior leadership of the Genovese family. The same testimony also became relevant to the competency fight that delayed the trial. Doctors had spent years seeing a patient who appeared severely impaired, while Savino described Gigante discussing business, masking conversations, and managing his public image. Prosecutors argued that medical experts needed to consider what Gigante did when he was not inside an examination room, because legal competency depended on his actual ability to understand and communicate. That argument did not ask psychiatrists to decide whether Savino was telling the truth, simply because prosecutors believed him. Courts had to weigh credibility and compare his account with other evidence. The larger point was that a competency evaluation could be incomplete if the doctor saw only behavior performed during appointments and lacked information about the defendant's functioning elsewhere. Gigante's case became a test of how much outside conduct should matter when medical observations and private behavior appeared to conflict. The courtroom eventually became the place where Savino's two roles met. He was a witness to the Windows racket and a target of the criminal organization he had helped expose. He appeared on a monitor because his illness and protected location made an ordinary appearance impossible. The defense questioned him, while the man accused of joining the plan to kill him sat in the courtroom. The running sink remained a small detail compared with the size of the federal case, yet it captured why Savino's testimony mattered. According to his account, Gigante used the water to make one conversation harder to hear, while telling Savino to strengthen the image of mental illness outside that room. Years later, prosecutors used that description while arguing that the apparent incapacity had been another layer of protection. Savino's survival also changed the balance that had once protected organized crime figures. In the Costello case 40 years earlier, a victim's refusal to identify the accused gunman helped prevent a conviction. By the 1990s, federal protection could keep an insider alive, hidden, and available long enough to testify, despite a proven conspiracy to kill him. Gigante now faced a system much better equipped to preserve the witnesses his organization most needed to silence. The murder conspiracy also reveals the point where secrecy stopped being enough. Gigante's system had been designed to limit what investigators could hear and who could connect him to criminal decisions. Savino had already crossed that barrier because he carried knowledge from inside the organization into the government's case. Once that happened, avoiding his name on a recording could not erase what he had personally seen. The only way to remove that knowledge would have been to remove the witness, which is why the conspiracy finding mattered. For Savino, the danger continued even after the government had enough evidence to charge Gigante. An indictment is public, but it does not make a protected witness safe. The competency litigation delayed the trial, while the people accused of wanting Savino dead remained part of an organized crime network with contacts outside prison. Keeping his location hidden was therefore tied directly to the years of delay. The longer the courts debated Gigante's condition, the longer Savino had to remain available without becoming reachable. That delay connected the witness case back to the psychiatric strategy. If Gigante could not be tried, Savino's testimony might never reach a jury at all. The government's ability to preserve him physically therefore solved only half the problem. Prosecutors also had to persuade doctors and judges that the defendant who appeared severely impaired was capable of understanding the case and helping his lawyers defend it. That legal question would eventually require the courts to compare the medical record against the same mafia evidence Savino and other insiders had helped uncover. The fight over competency would become a trial before the trial, stretching across most of the 1990s. His testimony would matter only if the courts first ruled that Gigante was capable of sitting through the case. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Savino could testify only if Gigante first reached a courtroom. Years of psychiatric findings still raised doubts about whether he could legally stand trial, keeping the competency question between the evidence and a jury. Section 8. 7 years to decide whether he could be tried. When federal prosecutors indicted Vincent Gigante in the Windows case on May 30, 1990, they expected a complicated organized crime prosecution. What followed became a separate legal battle that lasted most of the decade. Before jurors could hear recordings, mafia witnesses, or evidence about the window racket, doctors and judges had to decide whether the man identified by prosecutors as the Genovese boss was mentally capable of participating in his own trial. Judge Raymond Deary ordered psychiatric evaluations shortly after the indictment. 4 doctors examined Gigante during the early stages of the case, including court-appointed and defense experts. Based on the patient they observed, and the information then available, all 4 initially concluded that he was not competent to stand trial. Some raised concerns about malingering, but the overall medical picture still favored the defense and gave the court a substantial record supporting delay. The conclusion created a major obstacle, because competency is not a punishment prosecutors can ask a judge to ignore. A defendant must understand the nature of the proceedings and be able to assist his lawyers with a reasonable level of rational understanding. A person can be accused of serious crimes and still remain outside trial if that standard is not met. The government, therefore, had to challenge the medical opinions with evidence showing what Gigante was capable of doing away from doctors. The distinction between competency and guilt became especially important because the case carried extensive mafia evidence. A judge could believe Gigante had been a powerful criminal and still find him legally unable to stand trial if his present condition prevented meaningful participation. Prosecutors therefore needed evidence tied to Gigante's actual functioning during the period when doctors were evaluating him. His alleged mafia rank by itself could not establish legal competency. The Windows prosecution moved around him. Other defendants went to trial or entered guilty pleas, while Gigante's case was severed. By late 1991, the government had already secured results against people involved in the racket, yet the defendant it considered the most important remained in competency proceedings. The charges remained pending, even though the normal path from indictment to jury had stopped. Prosecutors began supplying doctors and courts with information that had not been part of many earlier evaluations. The material included Gigante's federal prison records from the early 1960s, his mother's original description of his childhood, surveillance, evidence of his private family life, and testimony from mafia figures who described him resolving disputes and directing criminal business. The government argued that a medical opinion based mainly on Gigante's presentation during an examination could be incomplete if he behaved differently in settings the doctor never saw. The prison records offered the earliest comparison. From 1960 through 1964, Gigante had worked, followed rules, completed assignments, and denied the severe psychiatric symptoms later associated with him. His mother had not reported the same lifelong history doctors heard during later competency cases. Prosecutors used those records to question when the severe condition had actually begun and why psychiatric treatment started around the period of renewed law enforcement attention in the middle of the 1960s. The records did not prove what Gigante's condition was 30 years later. A person can develop psychiatric or neurological illness after an earlier period of ordinary functioning, and the courts had to account for that possibility. Their importance came from testing claims about a long history of severe impairment. If later medical accounts described serious problems reaching far back into childhood or early adulthood, documents created during those years could confirm or challenge that history. The mafia evidence covered later periods. Witnesses placed Gigante functioning as a captain around the same era when the New Jersey court had found him incompetent. They described him settling construction disputes, participating in senior leadership meetings, limiting surveillance exposure, and eventually becoming the hidden authority above Salerno. After Salerno's arrest in 1985, later court findings placed Gigante as the boss in title as well as in fact. That evidence gave doctors a kind of information they normally would not have in an ordinary competency case. A psychiatric examination captures behavior during a limited period, often in a clinical or custodial setting. Gigante's alleged mafia role existed across years and involved repeated decisions with financial and personal consequences. Prosecutors argued that sustained leadership behavior could reveal capacities that a short examination missed, especially if the defendant deliberately changed how he behaved around doctors. Judge Eugene Nickerson eventually held extensive hearings to consider the full record. The issue became larger than whether one psychiatrist believed the patient in front of him. The court had to compare clinical observations with years of conduct described by people who dealt with Gigante inside organized crime. Some of those witnesses had serious criminal histories and cooperation agreements, which gave the defense strong grounds for attacking them. Their accounts still had value when they matched surveillance, recordings, or other independent evidence. The hearings forced both sides to confront uncertainty. The government could show activity that looked inconsistent with severe incapacity, but psychiatric illness does not always prevent a person from functioning in every setting. The defense could point to doctors who had personally examined Gigante and sincerely believed he was impaired, but those doctors had not always known about his private criminal behavior. The judge therefore had to decide how much weight to give each kind of evidence, rather than choosing between a simple story of complete health and complete disability. The additional information caused some doctors to change their opinions. Dr. Daniel Schwartz, one of the court-appointed experts, reconsidered his earlier view after learning more about Gigante's behavior outside the clinical setting and concluded that he could proceed. Dr. Jonas Rappaport also found significant evidence of malingering and moved toward a finding of competency. Their changes were important because the same doctors who had once accepted severe incapacity now had a different factual record. The medical disagreement did not disappear. Dr. Abraham Halpern continued believing Gigante was incompetent, while Dr. Stanley Portnow eventually took the position that Gigante had been competent earlier, but later developed organic brain problems serious enough to change his condition. The defense therefore still had experts who believed the defendant suffered genuine impairment, preventing the government from reducing the case to a simple claim that every doctor had been fooled. That disagreement is one reason the eventual court findings must be described carefully. Federal judges concluded that Gigante had deliberately feigned or exaggerated psychiatric symptoms for years, but they did not find that every medical problem was imaginary. The case involved experts reaching different conclusions in good faith after reviewing complicated evidence. The legal question was whether Gigante currently met the standard for trial, not whether prosecutors could erase his medical history. Gigante's physical health complicated the hearings further. He suffered from serious cardiovascular disease and had undergone a porcine aortic valve replacement in 1988. Doctors documented an irregular heartbeat, high blood pressure, and other medical problems that nobody needed to invent for the competency strategy to have an effect. The courts had to distinguish genuine physical illness from the separate question of whether psychiatric symptoms were being exaggerated. Physical illness also affected the practical question of how a trial could be conducted. Even a mentally competent defendant might need shorter court days, medical monitoring, frequent breaks, or delays after surgery. The judge had to consider whether those accommodations could protect Gigante's health without preventing the government from trying a case that had already been pending for years. Competency, therefore, became connected to courtroom logistics as well as psychiatry. On August 28, 1996, Judge Nickerson found Gigante mentally and physically competent to stand trial. The ruling accepted that he had real health problems while concluding that the evidence showed deliberate malingering and enough understanding to participate in the prosecution. The decision cleared the largest legal barrier that had kept the case from reaching a jury for more than 6 years. A new medical problem delayed the trial again. Gigante required major cardiac treatment and underwent open-heart surgery in early 1997. The court treated the heart condition as genuine and allowed time for recovery. As the trial approached, the defense presented new evidence suggesting possible Alzheimer's disease or other organic brain dysfunction, arguing that Gigante's condition had changed since the earlier competency ruling. The defense relied on neurological and psychological testing, including a PET scan interpreted by Dr. Monte Buchsbaum and neuropsychological work performed by Dr. Wilfred van Gorp. The evidence suggested abnormalities that the defense believed supported genuine cognitive decline. Government expert Dr. Jonathan Brody challenged the interpretation and raised questions about the effect Gigante's medications could have on the testing. The issue now required judges to separate two different periods. Evidence that Gigante had deliberately exaggerated symptoms years earlier could not automatically prove what he was capable of understanding after major heart surgery and possible neurological decline. A person can malinger at one point and later become impaired. The court therefore had to focus on Gigante's condition in 1997 rather than treating every earlier finding as permanent. The new testing also showed why competency had to remain a current question. If courts treated an old finding as final forever, they could try someone whose condition had deteriorated after the original hearing. Gigante's long history made that safeguard especially important because the government had strong evidence of earlier deception, creating a risk that later legitimate decline could be dismissed too quickly. The judge still had to assess the new medical claims on their own evidence. The case moved before Judge Jack Weinstein, who reviewed the medical evidence, earlier competency findings, mafia testimony, testing, and practical steps available to protect Gigante's health during trial. Weinstein concluded that the defense had not shown current incompetence. The court could allow breaks, keep medical personnel available, and adjust the schedule when necessary without preventing the prosecution from moving forward. On June 23, 1997, Gigante finally entered trial almost exactly 7 years after the original Windows indictment. The delay itself had become one of the clearest examples of how the psychiatric strategy protected him. Witnesses aged, memories changed, some people died, statutes of limitation continued running, and prosecutors had to maintain a case across most of a decade while repeatedly returning to the question of whether the defendant could understand what was happening. Time also worked against Gigante because the government gathered more evidence during those years. Mafia members who had once remained silent began cooperating. Gravano could explain commission meetings, Savino could describe the Windows racket and the restroom conversation, Chiodo could discuss Lucchese involvement, and Diarco could explain murder plans and leadership relationships. The longer the competency case continued, the larger the government's record became. The courts ultimately accepted a complicated conclusion. Gigante had genuine physical illness, and some psychiatric or cognitive problems may also have been real. Federal judges still found that he deliberately exaggerated or produced symptoms and remained capable of understanding the prosecution. The ruling avoided the simpler story in which a completely healthy man fooled every doctor for decades because the medical evidence never supported such a clean conclusion. That conclusion also explains why the bathrobe alone could never decide the case. Clothing, muttering, wandering, and strange public behavior could support an impression, but legal competency required a broader assessment of understanding and communication. Prosecutors succeeded only after placing those visible behaviors beside years of evidence showing organized crime function, while the defense continued presenting medical reasons the public image might reflect genuine illness. By the summer of 1997, the doctors and judges had finally finished deciding whether the case could begin. The government now faced a different burden. 6 mafia cooperators, recordings, labor evidence, murder conspiracy claims, and years of surveillance would be presented to jurors who had no obligation to accept everything prosecutors said, simply because a judge had already found Gigante competent. The length of the litigation also changed the meaning of the original 1990 indictment. What began as one branch of a larger Windows prosecution had become a test of how federal courts should handle a defendant whose medical presentation sharply conflicted with evidence of private criminal authority. Every new expert report had to be read beside old records, and every new cooperator could affect how doctors understood earlier behavior. The competency case therefore grew alongside the racketeering case rather than remaining a separate medical question. For prosecutors, the competency rulings in 1996 and 1997 removed only the legal barrier that had delayed the case. They did not prove that Gigante committed any racketeering act, and they did not relieve the government of its burden at trial. The cooperating witnesses still had to testify, the recordings and business evidence still had to be admitted and explained, and the defense still had the right to challenge the credibility of every criminal insider who took the stand. After 7 years of medical litigation, the case was finally moving from the question of whether Gigante could be tried to the separate question of what prosecutors could prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By June 1997, the competency fight had finally cleared the way for trial. Prosecutors now had to place years of mafia testimony, recordings, labor evidence, and murder allegations before a jury under the normal burden of proof. Section 9. The trial that put the bathrobe on trial. Vincent Gigante's federal trial began on June 23, 1997, in Brooklyn, after years of delays that had already made the case unusual. Prosecutors were asking jurors to consider a large organized crime enterprise involving the Genovese family, the Windows racket, murder conspiracies, and several older killings. The man at the defense table had spent decades associated with psychiatric hospitals and public displays of confusion, yet the government intended to prove that he had quietly directed one of New York's most powerful mafia organizations through much of the same period. The prosecution relied heavily on 6 cooperating organized crime witnesses: Sammy Gravano, Alphonse D'Arco, Peter Chiodo, Philip Leonetti, Gino Milano, and Peter Savino. Each man brought serious credibility problems. They had participated in crimes, some had been involved in violence, and all had reasons for cooperating with federal authorities. The defense could argue that witnesses facing prison or hoping for protection had strong incentives to give prosecutors information that helped their own situations. The government answered by connecting their testimony to other evidence. Gravano could describe commission meetings and the Gotti conflict. D'Arco could explain Lucchese leadership and plans involving violence. Chiodo could discuss the Windows operation and organized crime's influence over labor. Savino could describe the Genovese side of that racket and his own interactions with Gigante. Recordings, surveillance, business records, and older court findings supplied points where the jury could compare one witness against another. That structure mattered because no single cooperator had seen Gigante's entire career. One knew a construction dispute, another knew commission politics, another understood the window business, and another could explain a murder plan. Prosecutors had to persuade jurors that those separate accounts described the same hierarchy rather than a collection of unrelated stories. The defense could attack inconsistencies between witnesses and remind the jury that every cooperator had his own criminal history. The case also required prosecutors to handle the psychiatric history carefully. Judges had already ruled Gigante competent, so the jury was not being asked to decide whether he understood the trial. The government still needed to explain how a man widely photographed in pajamas and a bathrobe could have exercised the criminal authority the witnesses described. Evidence of private functioning, therefore, became part of the racketeering story, even though the legal competency question belonged to the judges. The distinction protected the jury's role. A competency ruling did not mean the judge had already decided Gigante was a mafia boss or guilty of any charged conspiracy. It meant only that he could understand the proceedings and assist in his defense. Jurors still had to evaluate the criminal evidence independently and could reject any allegation they believed prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The Windows evidence gave the jury a financial structure to examine. Prosecutors described contractors, labor relationships, illegal payments, extortion, and organized crime influence over public window replacement work. The evidence showed how Genovese and Lucchese figures could profit from ordinary construction without the boss appearing at every job or collecting every payment. Gigante's role was presented at the level of authority and coordination rather than street collection. Savino's recordings and testimony helped give that structure a human connection. Jurors could hear about the business relationships and then hear from the insider who said Gigante discussed the racket privately. Chiodo approached the same industry from the Lucchese side, allowing prosecutors to show that the operation crossed family lines. The government was effectively asking the jury to reconstruct the same hierarchy investigators had spent years learning to see. The murder allegations were more complicated. Prosecutors accused Gigante of participating in conspiracies involving John Gotti and Peter Savino, and also tried to connect him to several older mafia killings through racketeering acts. Those claims depended heavily on cooperating witnesses, describing decisions that had occurred years earlier, often without recordings of the final orders. The defense attacked the witnesses and argued that prosecutors were using men with serious criminal histories to build a case from memories shaped by cooperation agreements. The age of some allegations created additional problems. Memories fade, participants die, and details from old mafia conflicts can become mixed with later stories repeated inside the criminal world. Prosecutors therefore needed jurors to distinguish between reputation and proof. Gigante could be widely believed to have been powerful, without that belief establishing his responsibility for every killing associated with the Genovese family during the same period. The jury returned a mixed verdict. Gigante was found guilty of substantive racketeering and racketeering conspiracy. Jurors also convicted him of extortion conspiracy and conspiracy to make illegal labor payments tied to the Windows operation. Those findings established that the government had successfully connected him to the criminal enterprise and to the profitable business racket that had been under investigation since the 1980s. The jury also found the murder conspiracies involving Peter Savino and John Gotti proved. Savino's conspiracy had continued while he remained hidden under federal protection, and the government showed that the plan failed because the witness could not be located. The Gotti conspiracy was found to have continued through January 1988, supporting the government's claim that Gigante joined senior mafia figures who wanted the Gambino boss killed after the unauthorized murder of Paul Castellano. Other violent allegations failed. Jurors found that prosecutors had not proved Gigante's responsibility for racketeering acts involving the murders of Jerry Papa, Frank Narducci, Rocco Marinucci, and Enrico Carini. On allegations involving Anthony Caponegro, Fred Salerno, John Keys Simone, and Frank Sindone, the jury could not reach unanimous agreement. Those results prevent the older killings from being treated as established crimes by Gigante. The mixed outcome makes the trial more useful than a simple guilty verdict because it shows jurors separating evidence. The same people who accepted the Windows charges and the Savino and Gotti conspiracies rejected or deadlocked on several murder claims. The verdict, therefore, provides a line between what prosecutors alleged and what 12 jurors were actually willing to find beyond a reasonable doubt. That line is especially important in a mafia case because later retellings often collect every accusation around a famous defendant and present them as one proven criminal record. Gigante's trial does not support that approach. The verdict established serious racketeering and murder conspiracy conduct while leaving several homicide allegations unproved. Preserving that distinction makes the proven case stronger because it does not depend on claims the jury refused to accept. The government's presentation also had to overcome a risk created by Gigante's fame. By 1997, the pajamas and psychiatric history were closely associated with him, and jurors could arrive with strong impressions before hearing a single witness. The trial court therefore had to keep the case focused on admissible evidence rather than on the mythology that had grown around his public behavior. A strange photograph could not prove racketeering, just as an old newspaper label could not prove murder. The government's burden remained tied to specific acts, specific conspiracies, and the enterprise charged in the indictment. That is why the rejected allegations deserve as much attention as the convictions. They show the jury exercising the discrimination the system required. Jurors could believe Gigante was a mafia boss and still decide that the evidence did not establish his responsibility for a particular killing. They could accept one cooperator on one event and remain unconvinced about another. The verdict, therefore, produced a more precise picture than either side's broad courtroom story. Gigante was guilty of serious racketeering conduct, but the government had not proved every violent act it placed before the jury. That precision carried into sentencing and appeal. The courts punished the conduct supported by the verdict and reviewed the legal errors actually raised, rather than treating Gigante's reputation as proof of everything prosecutors had alleged over the years. The surviving convictions still left a substantial federal case. The Gotti charge later required another legal adjustment. A separate standalone count concerning the conspiracy was dismissed because the applicable statute of limitations had expired. The broader racketeering finding, involving the same conspiracy, remained part of the case. The result preserved the jury's factual finding, while removing one charge that had been brought too late. The post-trial federal opinion counted 32 racketeering predicate acts that the jury had found proved. Those acts supported the larger conclusion that Gigante had participated in the Genovese enterprise through a pattern of criminal conduct rather than one isolated offense. The finding gave prosecutors the kind of result they had been trying to reach since first identifying him as the hidden leader years earlier. The verdict also changed the public meaning of the bathrobe. Before trial, the image had often been treated as a strange feature of an alleged mobster who might be too sick to prosecute. After conviction, federal judges and a jury had separately resolved the two questions required to proceed. The courts found him competent, and jurors found him responsible for racketeering conduct. The clothing remained part of the story, but it no longer prevented the legal system from reaching a criminal judgment. On December 18, 1997, Judge Weinstein sentenced Gigante to 12 years in federal prison. He also imposed a $1.25 million fine, a special assessment, and 5 years of supervised release. The judge considered Gigante's age and serious physical condition when deciding the sentence, including the heart disease and surgeries that had complicated the competency proceedings. The sentencing decision again required a distinction between deception and real illness. A court could conclude that Gigante intentionally misled doctors about psychiatric incapacity while still accepting that his cardiovascular problems were serious. The judge granted a downward departure based on age and physical condition, showing that the legal system did not need to pretend Gigante was perfectly healthy in order to punish the crimes the jury had found proved. Gigante appealed the convictions. His lawyers challenged the competency rulings, the use of live video testimony for Savino, the admission of statements from alleged co-conspirators, and other evidentiary decisions. In January 1999, the Second Circuit affirmed the surviving convictions. The appeals court found that some hearsay evidence had been admitted too broadly, but it concluded that those errors were harmless when measured against the strength of the remaining evidence. The court also upheld the decision allowing Savino to testify from a protected location. His terminal cancer, security concerns, and the live opportunity for cross-examination made the situation unusual enough for the procedure to survive constitutional review. Gigante's competency finding remained intact as well, closing another route toward undoing the trial. The appeal did not convert the rejected murder allegations into proof. The distinction between accusation and conviction remained exactly where the jury had placed it. Gigante's established federal record now included racketeering, the Windows conspiracies, and the Savino murder conspiracy, while the Gotti conspiracy remained proved as part of the racketeering case. Claims that jurors rejected or could not decide remained outside that proven record. The outcome represented the opposite of the Costello prosecution 4 decades earlier. In 1957, investigators believed Gigante had carried out a shooting, but the victim would not identify him, and the case produced no conviction. In 1997, prosecutors arrived with multiple cooperating witnesses, business evidence, surveillance, and a racketeering law designed to connect leadership with crimes carried out through an organization. The government no longer depended on one frightened or unwilling witness to prove one isolated act. Federal prison removed Gigante from the daily routine that had helped create his public image. The Triangle Social Club, Sullivan Street, his mother's neighborhood, and the familiar Greenwich Village walks were replaced by federal custody and medical treatment. The government had finally achieved what the commission prosecution had failed to do in 1985 by convicting the man later identified as the real Genovese boss. The appeal closed the main routes Gigante had used to challenge the 1997 judgment. His competency finding remained in place, the surviving convictions stood, and the procedure used for Savino's protected testimony survived review. The criminal case that had begun with the Windows indictment had therefore reached a stable legal outcome after nearly a decade of litigation. That outcome still left the psychiatric record with significance beyond the convictions themselves. Judges had repeatedly concluded that Gigante exaggerated or produced symptoms during competency proceedings, and the appeals court had left those findings intact. Those conclusions were part of the legal history, even though they were not a separate jury verdict about every medical claim Gigante had made over the years. The distinction remained important because the record also contained genuine physical illness and continuing disagreement among experts about parts of his condition. The trial record now brought together evidence that had once existed in separate worlds. Prison files, mafia testimony, surveillance, business records, and medical findings all reached the same federal case, allowing judges and jurors to evaluate them against one another. The separation that had protected Gigante for years had narrowed because the government finally possessed records from both his public medical life and his private criminal activity. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gigante's convictions survived appeal, and the medical history that had delayed the case still carried legal consequences. Years later, prosecutors returned to the competency record in a separate case centered on what he had told the doctors. Section 10. The Confession That Ended the Act. On January 17, 2002, federal prosecutors announced another case against Vincent Gigante, who was already serving the sentence imposed after his racketeering conviction. The new indictment alleged that the aging Genovese boss had continued influencing organized crime activity from federal custody, and that messages moved between him and people outside prison. His son Andrew was accused of helping carry communications and was charged in the broader prosecution. The prison leadership claims reflected the government's belief that physical custody had not completely separated Gigante from the organization he once controlled. Prosecutors described activity involving Waterfront and International Longshoremen's Association, extortion in New York, New Jersey, and Miami. Those allegations should remain identified as prosecution claims, because the case did not end with a jury examining every part of the prison leadership theory. Andrew's alleged role gave the case a family connection that investigators could follow. Prosecutors said he acted as one of the people carrying information between his father and others involved in Genovese activity. The accusation also placed a new generation inside a story that had begun with Vincent Gigante as a young boxer around Vito Genovese almost half a century earlier. This time, however, the government's most important charge against the father concerned the legal strategy that had delayed his previous prosecution. The obstruction count created a more direct path. Federal prosecutors accused Gigante of intentionally misleading doctors during the years when courts were trying to decide whether he was competent to stand trial. Judges had already found malingering, mafia witnesses had described private behavior inconsistent with the most severe public presentation, and some psychiatrists had changed their conclusions after receiving additional information. Gigante himself had never entered a guilty plea admitting that deception. That difference mattered because judicial findings and personal admissions do different things. A judge can examine evidence and conclude that a defendant deliberately feigned symptoms, but the defendant can continue denying the finding through appeal. A guilty plea requires the defendant to accept criminal responsibility for conduct supporting the charge. For Gigante, the obstruction case therefore offered prosecutors something they had never received during the long competency battle: an admission from the man at the center of it. On April 7, 2003, Gigante appeared before federal judge I. Leo Glasser and pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice. During the plea, he acknowledged that he had knowingly and intentionally misled doctors who evaluated his competency between 1990 and 1997. The admission reached the exact period when his psychiatric presentation had delayed the Windows prosecution for years. The scope of the plea matters. Gigante did not confess that every psychiatric symptom he had ever shown was false. He did not establish that every hospital admission over 3 decades had been unnecessary, and his plea did not erase real cardiovascular disease or the medical experts who continued believing he suffered genuine impairment. His admission concerned the intentional deception of competency doctors during the federal prosecution. That narrower confession was enough to close the central legal argument that had followed him since the 1990 indictment. Prosecutors no longer needed only prison records, mafia witnesses, surveillance, or judicial findings to show that he had misled evaluators. The defendant himself accepted criminal responsibility for doing it. The admission confirmed deception during the period that mattered most to the federal case, without giving permission to rewrite every medical event in his life as fake. The plea added 3 years to the federal sentence Gigante was already serving. Andrew Gigante also resolved his part of the case by pleading guilty to an extortion conspiracy and received a prison sentence of his own. The father and son appearing in the same federal prosecution created a quiet connection to an older mafia meeting where witnesses remembered Gigante expressing that he did not want his sons formally entering organized crime. There is no need to invent how Gigante felt about that outcome. The record is enough. Years earlier, another mafia boss had spoken about a son entering the organization, while Gigante expressed a different preference. Decades later, Andrew stood convicted in a federal extortion case connected to the same organized crime world his father had spent years leading. The family detail works because it is documented, not because it proves a hidden motive. The 2003 plea also completed a legal cycle beginning with the New Jersey case. In 1971, a judge had accepted medical evidence showing Gigante could not stand trial. The court did not possess the large body of mafia testimony and surveillance later gathered by federal prosecutors. That incompetency ruling became part of Gigante's history, and doctors examining him years afterward naturally considered it when reaching their own conclusions. In 1990, 4 psychiatrists initially agreed that Gigante was not competent. The government's answer required years of work. Prosecutors produced old prison records, family history, private household evidence, mafia testimony, surveillance, and examples of Gigante making criminal decisions during periods when he appeared severely impaired in medical settings. Some doctors changed their conclusions after seeing that material, while others continued disagreeing. Federal judges eventually found Gigante competent and concluded that he had been malingering. The 1997 trial then placed the criminal evidence before jurors, who convicted him on racketeering, Windows charges, and the Savino murder conspiracy, while finding the Gotti conspiracy proved as part of racketeering and rejecting several older murder allegations. The Second Circuit affirmed the surviving convictions in 1999. The obstruction plea gave that history a final piece. Gigante had spent years fighting over whether the government could prove deception strongly enough to place him before a jury. 6 years after that jury convicted him, he admitted intentionally misleading the doctors involved in the competency process. The bathrobe and public confusion had become famous, but the legal importance came from what happened inside the examination room. Contemporary reporting from the plea hearing noted that Gigante appeared more engaged and conversational with Andrew than reporters had often seen during earlier court appearances. That observation cannot establish a medical conclusion, because a short courtroom exchange says little about a person's full psychiatric condition. Its value lies only in showing how closely the public continued watching for differences between Gigante's presentation and his behavior after the guilty plea. The confession also changes how the earlier evidence should be read. The 1960 prison records mattered because they showed ordinary functioning before severe psychiatric incapacity became a legal issue. The Triangle Social Club meetings mattered because witnesses described Gigante resolving mafia business during years when doctors received a different picture. The rule against using his name mattered because it showed a leader thinking carefully about electronic surveillance. The commission case showed the system working at a larger level. Federal prosecutors identified Salerno as the Genovese boss, convicted him, and sent him toward what was effectively a life sentence. Later evidence placed Gigante above him. The government had successfully attacked the leadership of several mafia families, while leaving the man later found to control the Genovese organization outside the central case. That outcome shows how Gigante combined psychiatric deception with several layers of organizational distance. The family could place visible authority in front of him, use captains and intermediaries for routine business, limit meetings, avoid speaking his name, and rely on a medical history if prosecution finally reached him. The strategy worked through several layers that supported one another. Removing any single layer did not automatically expose the person at the top. The Gotti conspiracy showed the level of decisions Gigante could make while remaining publicly associated with severe impairment. A jury found that he participated in an agreement to murder another family boss after the unauthorized killing of Paul Castellano. That finding placed him inside commission-level politics involving the leadership of multiple families. The Windows case showed the financial side of the same authority. Organized crime influenced union relationships and contractors involved in ordinary public housing work, allowing mafia-connected businesses to gain advantages and generate money. A federal jury found Gigante responsible for extortion and illegal labor payment conspiracies tied to that system. Savino showed the danger created when an insider could explain those relationships. His cooperation produced recordings, testimony, and the story of the running sink, while the jury found that Gigante joined a conspiracy to have him killed. Witness protection kept Savino hidden long enough for him to appear by live video at the 1997 trial. The competency hearings tied every part of the story together, because prosecutors needed evidence from the criminal world to challenge what doctors had seen. A psychiatrist could observe Gigante appearing confused during an examination, while a mafia witness could describe him understanding business, recognizing people, settling disputes, and protecting himself from surveillance. Judges had to decide which behavior showed his actual ability to understand court proceedings. The final answer never became as simple as saying Gigante was completely healthy. His heart disease was serious and required major surgery. Some experts believed genuine psychiatric or neurological problems remained. Federal courts still found that he intentionally exaggerated or produced symptoms, and his own 2003 plea established deliberate deception during the federal competency evaluations. That legal precision matters, because the popular version of Gigante's story often becomes cleaner than the evidence. The bathrobe is memorable, so it is tempting to describe every symptom across decades as one continuous act. The record supports a more careful conclusion. Gigante admitted misleading competency doctors between 1990 and 1997, and federal courts found deliberate feigning extending back much earlier. Real medical problems existed beside that deception. Gigante remained in federal custody after the plea. By then, he was an elderly man with a long history of heart disease and other medical problems. The additional 3-year sentence made release even less likely, and his remaining years were spent inside the federal prison medical system rather than the Greenwich Village neighborhood where his public behavior had become famous. On December 19, 2005, Vincent Gigante died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 77 years old. Contemporary reports noted his history of serious heart disease, while the immediate cause of death was not initially made public. The final setting was far removed from Sullivan Street, the Triangle Social Club, and the Manhattan sidewalks, where photographers had once waited for another image of the bathrobe. His death ended a criminal career carrying more legal limits than later mafia legends sometimes allows. Gigante was never convicted of shooting Frank Costello, even though the FBI's official history identifies him as the gunman sent by Vito Genovese. The 1997 jury rejected several murder allegations and failed to reach agreement on others. He was never convicted of personally ordering the bombing that killed Frank DeCicco, and the full 2002 theory that he continued directing the Genovese family from prison never received a complete jury verdict. The proven record remains extensive, without adding anything beyond it. Gigante was convicted in the 1959 federal narcotics conspiracy. Federal courts later found that he rose through the Genovese family and became the hidden authority behind Salerno before taking the boss position himself. A federal jury convicted him of racketeering, extortion conspiracy, illegal labor payment conspiracy, and the Savino murder conspiracy, while finding the Gotti conspiracy proved as part of the racketeering case. He received a 12-year federal sentence, a $1.25 million fine, and later pleaded guilty to obstruction for intentionally misleading competency doctors. The beginning of the story still offers the clearest comparison with the end. In 1960, Gigante was a federal prisoner in his early 30s. The Costello shooting had happened only a few years earlier, and his narcotics conviction had placed him inside Lewisburg. Prison employees described him as a capable worker. His medical history did not contain the severe psychiatric story that would later dominate his court cases, and his mother described a childhood without the same long history doctors heard years afterward. Those routine records sat in government files while the rest of his life changed. Gigante returned to New York, entered psychiatric treatment, was found incompetent in New Jersey, became a Genovese captain, rose to consigliere, operated behind Salerno, and eventually took formal control of the family. He walked the village in robes while associates avoided speaking his name. Federal prosecutors missed him in the commission case, then spent most of the 1990s fighting to place him before a jury. The sequence is what makes the real story more unsettling than the mafia world shown in Goodfellas. The film presents organized crime through visible crews, robberies, money, betrayals, and killings. Gigante's strongest protection came from making the person at the top hard to identify and even harder to prosecute. The criminal system around him depended on distance, silence, medical records, trusted intermediaries, and the advantage created when different observers saw completely different versions of the same man. The bathrobe became the image everyone remembered because a camera could capture it in one frame. The more important part could not be photographed as easily. It was the gap between what doctors saw, what federal agents suspected, what mafia associates knew, and what prosecutors could actually prove in court. Gigante lived inside that gap for years, using the structure around him to keep those different worlds from lining up. By the time they finally did line up, the evidence came from places separated by decades. Prison records from the early 1960s, competency rulings from the 1970s, mafia meetings from the 1970s and 1980s, commission surveillance, Windows recordings, cooperating witnesses, medical experts, a 1997 jury, and a later guilty plea all became parts of the same record. No single piece explains the entire story, but together they show why the deception lasted as long as it did. In 2003, the strongest evidence against the performance came from Gigante himself in federal court. The elderly prisoner admitted that he had intentionally misled the doctors deciding whether he could stand trial. More than 40 years after ordinary Lewisburg records described the younger boxer as capable of functioning, Vincent Gigante finally supplied the admission prosecutors had spent decades trying to prove. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.